Welcome to Sleeping Times. Did you know that in the Middle Ages, the rich died earlier than the poor for a surprising reason? While nobles in their castles devoured crystallized sugar, meats drenched in fat, and exotic spices, peasants eating dark bread and vegetable soup lived longer, healthier lives. Luxury was literally poisonous. Each royal banquet was a gamble against death. Each refined dish carried invisible dangers, and the most basic food, bread, sometimes hid fungi that caused terrifying hallucinations and gangrene. The cruel irony? Everything the medieval elite desperately desired was slowly killing them, while the food they despised as unworthy could have saved them. If you want to learn history while you relax, subscribe now for stories like this every week. Oh, and don't forget to leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from and what time it is there. It's always amazing to see how our community is spread across the world. Now, how about turning off the lights, finding a comfortable position, and preparing yourself for a fascinating journey through medieval tables, where we'll discover that our ancestors weren't so different from us, and that the choices we make today echo mistakes made 700 years ago. Imagine a time when sugar didn't come in colorful packets in supermarket aisles, but arrived in small crystallized blocks, transported by caravans crossing scorching deserts and tempestuous seas. In the Middle Ages, especially between the 12th and 15th centuries, refined sugar was a symbol of power so potent that only kings, nobles, and extremely wealthy merchants could even dream of touching it. Extracted mainly from sugarcane cultivated in distant places like the Middle East, Cyprus, and later in the Madeira Islands, this white, crystalline powder was literally weighed on jewelers' scales, and its commercial value rivaled rare spices like saffron and pepper. It wasn't just a sweetener, it was a statement, an ostentatious display of wealth that told the world, "I can afford the impossible." In the great European courts, sugar transformed into edible art. Elaborate sculptures called subtleties were created by specialized confectioners, true artists who molded castles, mythological creatures, saints, and even entire battle scenes using sugar paste, egg white, and natural dyes. These pieces could take weeks to complete and were presented at the end of banquets as the spectacular grand finale, drawing applause and exclamations of admiration from guests. Sugar was painted with gold leaf, perfumed with rose water, and sculpted with such minute detail that some nobles hesitated to destroy the works to eat them. But inevitably, gluttony conquered aesthetic appreciation, and those sweet towers were dismantled, piece by piece, by the eager fingers of medieval aristocracy. Have you ever stopped to think about how much sugar you consume in a single day? At breakfast, in your lunch soda, in that seemingly harmless dessert? The World Health Organization recommends no more than 25 grams of added sugar per day for adults, approximately 6 teaspoons. But the reality is that the average American consumes more than 77 grams daily, according to data from the United States Department of Agriculture. In the Middle Ages, this excessive consumption wasn't a mass epidemic, but a deadly privilege reserved exclusively for the elite. Medieval nobles had no idea that each sugary banquet was corroding their teeth, overwhelming their organs, and shortening their lives. For them, eating sugar wasn't a risk, it was a divine right. Medical records from the era, though primitive, began documenting a peculiar phenomenon among the nobility: severe tooth deterioration that rarely affected peasants. Barber surgeons and court physicians observed mouths full of blackened teeth, inflamed gums, and painful abscesses that caused constant suffering. Queen Elizabeth I of England, already in the late Middle Ages and early Renaissance, was famous for her passion for sweets and the deplorable state of her teeth. Chroniclers of the time described how her gums were so deteriorated that she chewed with difficulty and rarely smiled in public. Curiously, having bad teeth became, in a perverse way, a status symbol, as it demonstrated that a person had regular access to expensive sugar. Medieval medicine still didn't understand the connection between sugar consumption and tooth decay. The theory of humours, inherited from Galen and Hippocrates, dominated medical thinking. Diseases were believed to be caused by imbalances between blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. When a noble suffered from excruciating tooth pain, the physician might prescribe bloodletting, the application of leeches, or even tooth extraction without anesthesia, a procedure performed by barbers with crude tools that looked more like torture instruments than medical equipment. Sugar, in this worldview, was considered beneficial, a substance hot and moist that balanced the humours and strengthened the body. Physicians even recommended consuming sugar to purify the blood and treat various ailments. But medieval sugar wasn't only refined and white. There was also honey, far more accessible and widely used by all social classes as the main sweetener for millennia. Honey held a special place in the medieval diet. It was produced locally by beekeepers, used to make mead, an extremely popular fermented alcoholic beverage, and employed as a natural preservative and remedy. Monasteries maintained extensive beehives and monks developed sophisticated beekeeping techniques. However, even honey, when consumed in excess, brought its own health problems, especially when combined with refined white bread that was also becoming a symbol of prestige. White bread deserves special attention in this story. While peasants ate dark bread made from rye, barley, or even flour mixed with peas and beans, dense, nutritious breads rich in fiber, the nobility demanded refined wheat bread, as white and soft as possible. Specialized bakers used increasingly fine sieves to remove the bran and germ from the wheat, resulting in snow-white flour that produced light, delicate breads. The problem? This refinement process removed precisely the most nutritious parts of the grain: B-complex vitamins, iron, magnesium, and the fiber essential for digestion. Medieval white bread was essentially empty carbohydrates that caused blood sugar spikes without offering significant nutritional benefits. Compare this to the modern paradox. For decades, industrially produced white bread dominated supermarket shelves in America, sold as a symbol of modernity and convenience. Only in recent decades has there been a return to whole grains, as nutritional science revealed what medieval peasants instinctively knew: that dark, dense bread, though less refined, was infinitely healthier. Could it be that our poor ancestors, eating their dark breads and vegetable soups, had inadvertently discovered the secret to a more balanced diet than that enjoyed by their lords in castle towers? The medieval obsession with refinement and whiteness went beyond sugar and bread. There was also almond milk, not the modern version we find today, in refrigerated Tetra Pak containers, but a medieval preparation made by grinding almonds with water and often adding generous amounts of sugar. During periods of religious fasting, when the consumption of dairy was prohibited by the Catholic Church, almond milk became indispensable in noble kitchens. It was used to make puddings, creamy sauces, and sweet beverages served in silver cups. But the cost of imported almonds and the sugar needed to make it palatable meant that only the rich could transform religious fasting into another opportunity for culinary ostentation. Medieval banquets were theatrical performances where food and power intertwined in complex ways. A single banquet in the court of King Edward III of England could serve dozens of dishes, including roasted swans reconstructed with their feathers, peacocks presented as if alive, and towers of fruits crystallized in sugar that gleamed in candlelight. Between the savory dishes and roasted meats, sweet interludes would emerge: fruit compotes cooked with honey and sugar, dried fruits imported from the Mediterranean, and comfits, which were spices coated with layers of crystallized sugar. Each bite was an explosion of concentrated sweetness that our modern palates would find almost unbearable, but which for medieval nobility represented the height of sophistication. The question of social status linked to eating in the Middle Ages reveals a cruel irony. The poor, who ate a limited but relatively balanced diet of whole grain breads, vegetable soups, legumes, a little cheese, and rarely meat, were nutritionally healthier than their lords. While peasants suffered malnutrition and hunger in times of poor harvests, when food was available, their basic diet provided fiber, plant proteins, and essential nutrients. Meanwhile, nobles, even with abundant access to food, developed what we would today call diseases of abundance. Gout, caused by excess animal protein, and alcohol, obesity, type 2 diabetes, though undiagnosed at the time, and severe cardiovascular problems. Historical documents reveal medieval recipes that make us shudder from a modern nutritional standpoint. Lèche lardée was an English dish that combined fatty pork with sweetened almond milk and eggs, cooked until it formed a dense pudding that was served cold. Crisples were small cookies fried in pork lard and then soaked in hot honey. Pain ragoon was a mixture of white bread soaked in sweet wine, honey, and rare spices, forming a sweet paste that was molded and decorated with more sugar. Each of these creations represented a triumph of medieval culinary ingenuity and a slow, delicious nutritional disaster. The medieval cookbooks that have survived to this day, such as Le Viandier by Taillevent, 14th century, or The Form of Cury, compiled by the cooks of King Richard II of England, are historical treasures that allow us to reconstruct not only what people ate, but how they thought about food. There is an almost obsessive emphasis on masking the natural flavors of ingredients. Meats were covered with thick sauces sweetened with honey, fish were seasoned with complex combinations of sweet and bitter spices, even vegetables were often cooked with sugar or honey. This preference for the artificial over the natural reflected a broader philosophy. Nature was something to be dominated, transformed, and improved by the hand of civilized humanity. There was also a medical dimension to excessive sweetness. Medieval dietetic theory, based on the teachings of Arab physicians like Avicenna, suggested that different foods had hot, cold, dry, or moist properties. Sugar was classified as hot in the second degree and moist in the first, making it ideal for balancing meats considered cold or dry. Court physicians prescribed specific amounts of sugar to be consumed with certain foods, believing this would facilitate digestion and promote health. This medical pseudoscience gave intellectual justification for excessive consumption. You weren't indulging in gluttony, you were following professional medical guidance. Think of modern advertisements for sugary cereals for children, soft drinks presented as energy sources, or chocolate bars sold as nutritious snacks. There is a disturbing parallel with the Middle Ages, where sugar was sold by physicians and apothecaries as medicine and a health tonic. The 20th century sugar industry employed similar strategies, funding studies that minimized the risks of sugar while demonizing fats. For decades, low-fat products flooded the American market, but compensated for the reduction in fat with added sugar, creating an epidemic of obesity and diabetes. History, it seems, has a disturbing way of repeating itself, only changing its costume. In the end, those medieval nobles, seated at their tables covered with embroidered linen tablecloths, savoring their sugar sculptures and golden comfits, had no idea they were participating in a nutritional experiment with deadly consequences. Each banquet was a celebration of life, an affirmation of power, a denial of mortality through indulgence. But somewhere, in distant villages, a peasant bit into his dark bread and drank his vegetable soup, living a life perhaps longer and certainly with better teeth than his lord in the castle tower. And this leads us to a troubling question. If you could choose, would you prefer the poor but nutritious diet of the peasant or the deadly luxury of the noble's table? Meat in the Middle Ages was not simply food, It was hierarchy materialized in every bite. Imagine the great halls of medieval castles on feast nights, where the air grew thick with smoke from enormous fireplaces where whole animals rotated on spits, dripping fat that sizzled and crackled over glowing coals. The smell of roasted meat mingled with the aromas of rosemary, thyme, and sage, creating an almost intoxicating atmosphere of carnivorous abundance. In medieval society, the quantity and type of meat you consumed instantly communicated your social position with brutal clarity. Nobles devoured red meat in quantities we would today consider obscene, while peasants lived mainly on grains, legumes, and occasionally some salted pork or a chicken too old to lay eggs. Medieval noble banquets were veritable orgies of animal protein. Records of royal feasts document the consumption of dozens of oxen, hundreds of pigs, thousands of birds, as well as deer, boar, rabbits, and even more exotic animals like swans, peacocks, herons, and even dolphins, which were technically classified as fish by the church and therefore permitted on fasting days. A typical banquet in the court of a king or great duke could serve between 15 and 20 different meat dishes presented in theatrical succession. Each animal was carefully roasted, boiled, fried, or prepared in elaborate pies with the implicit expectation that guests would generously sample each option. The idea of moderation simply did not exist. Refusing abundant meat would be insulting to the host and demonstrating weakness. Have you ever wondered how much meat is really necessary for a healthy life? Modern nutritionists recommend about 85 to 140 grams of meat per meal, a few times a week, with emphasis on variety and balance with vegetables, grains, and legumes. But in the Middle Ages, a noble at a banquet could easily consume more than a kilogram of meat in a single night, not counting the days before and after where consumption remained elevated. Studies of skeletal remains of medieval nobles reveal consistent evidence of gout, a painful form of arthritis caused by the accumulation of uric acid crystals in the joints, directly linked to excessive consumption of red meat and alcohol. The rich literally paid with chronic physical pain for the privilege of eating meat without limits. The preparation of medieval meat had peculiarities that would make it strange and often dangerous to our modern palates. Without adequate refrigeration, meat began to deteriorate rapidly, especially in warm months. To disguise the smell and taste of meat beginning to spoil, medieval cooks developed extremely spiced sauces using expensive spices imported from the Orient. Pepper, ginger, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, and cardamom were ground and mixed with vinegar, verjuice, juice from sour green grapes, wine, and sometimes honey or sugar, creating intense flavors that masked any note of decomposition. These spices were so valuable that they were kept in locked coffers, sometimes alongside the family jewels. There is a fascinating historical debate about whether spices were really used to disguise spoiled meat or whether they were simply a status symbol so important that their use was exaggerated regardless of the meat's freshness. Some historians argue that nobles had access to fresh meat through constant hunting and slaughter, so spices served mainly to demonstrate wealth. Others point to evidence that, especially in besieged castles or during long winters, inadequately preserved meat was indeed consumed with the help of heavy spices. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. Spices fulfilled both functions, being simultaneously a status symbol and a practical solution to preservation limitations. Medieval meat preservation techniques were ingenious but not without health risks. Salting was the most common method. Meat was completely covered with coarse salt and left to cure for weeks or months. The salt extracted moisture, creating an environment hostile to bacteria, but it also created a final product so salty that it needed to be soaked in fresh water for hours, sometimes days, before it could be cooked. This process reduced the nutritional value of the meat and created risks of hypertension for those who consumed it regularly. Smoking was another popular technique, where meat was hung in chambers filled with smoke from aromatic woods like oak, beech, or apple. The result was flavorful but also contained carcinogenic compounds formed during the smoking process. Compare medieval techniques with our modern processed meats: bacon cured with nitrites, vacuum-packed sausages, hams injected with saline solution. The World Health Organization classified processed meats as a Group 1 carcinogen, the same category as tobacco, due to strong evidence linking their regular consumption to colorectal cancer. The average American consumes about 18 kilograms of bacon per year, not to mention hot dogs, salamis, and other cured meats. Are we really so far from our medieval ancestors who drenched their meat in salt and smoke, sacrificing future health for immediate pleasure and preservation? The technology has changed, but the human impulse to consume meat preserved in potentially harmful ways remains remarkably constant. Hunting was more than sustenance for medieval nobility; it was ritual, sport, and a demonstration of masculinity and power. Large estates maintained hunting parks, vast stretches of enclosed forest where deer, boar, and other prey were protected and kept exclusively for the hunting pleasure of nobles. Peasants caught hunting on these lands could be mutilated, blinded, or even executed, depending on the perceived severity of the crime and the mood of the local lord. Medieval hunting laws were brutally unequal. A noble could hunt freely even on peasant lands, but a starving peasant who killed a rabbit to feed his family could lose a hand. Game meat, deer, boar, hares, was loaded with social significance that went far beyond its nutritional value. When a large animal like a deer was killed after a hunt, there were elaborate rituals for its dismemberment and distribution. The ceremony of breaking involved the master hunter skillfully separating the animal into specific parts, each destined for people of different status. The best cuts, the loin, the haunches, went to the lord's table. Lower parts were distributed to knights and higher status servants. Internal organs and less desirable pieces went to serfs and hunting dogs. Even in the death and distribution of a single animal, medieval social hierarchy was meticulously reinforced. Nothing was wasted, but everything was unequal. The medieval preference for fresh meat often meant meat that had barely been hung or aged. Today we know that aging meat, allowing natural enzymes to break down muscle fibers in a controlled environment, dramatically improves texture and flavor. But in the Middle Ages, the fresher, the better it was considered, resulting in meat that was often tough and needed to be cooked for hours in stews or roasted until well done and almost dry. The idea of a rare steak, pink in the center, would have been repugnant to most medieval eaters who associated visible blood with danger and contamination. Ironically, overcooking meat not only made it less palatable but also destroyed many vitamins, especially those of the B complex. There was also a hierarchy among the types of meat themselves that reflected medieval medical theories about digestion and food quality. Poultry meat was considered superior to terrestrial mammal meat because birds lived closer to the sky, the divine realm. Within poultry, there was another hierarchy: peacocks and swans at the top, followed by herons and storks, then geese and ducks, and finally chickens and capons at the base. Among mammals, young deer and lamb were preferred, followed by pork and last beef, which was considered meat more suitable for workers than for refined nobles. These distinctions were taken so seriously that serving the wrong type of meat to a high-status guest could be interpreted as a grave insult. Meat consumption was intimately linked to the Christian religious calendar of the Middle Ages. The Catholic Church mandated extended periods of fasting where meat consumption was prohibited. Every Friday, all of Lent, 40 days before Easter, the days of Ember, and various other sacred occasions. In total, this represented about 1/3 of the year where technically no one should eat meat. For peasants, this restriction was relatively easy to follow, since they rarely had meat anyway. But for nobles accustomed to daily carnivorous banquets, the fasting periods were simultaneously spiritual trial and culinary challenge that stimulated fascinating culinary innovations. Medieval nobles found creative loopholes in the fasting rules. Fish were permitted, so any aquatic creature technically qualified, not just true fish, but also beavers, whose scaly tails made them fish, according to convenient interpretations, otters, seals, and even barnacle geese, black-bellied geese that, according to medieval belief, were born from sea mollusks and therefore were fish, not meat. There were serious theological debates about whether puffins, which spent much time in water, counted as fish. Coastal monasteries developed sophisticated fish farming techniques, raising carp, pike, and trout in specially constructed tanks to ensure constant supply during Lent. The most expensive and prestigious fish was the lamprey, an eel-like parasitic creature that we would today consider repugnant, but which in the Middle Ages was a royal delicacy. The excesses of meat had medical consequences that medieval physicians observed but did not fully understand. Gout, already mentioned, was so common among nobles that it was nicknamed the disease of kings. It caused painful swelling in the joints, especially in the toes, making it difficult to walk or even wear boots. Medieval treatment included bloodletting, application of herbal poultices, and ironically, dietary recommendations to reduce meat and wine, advice that nobles rarely followed seriously. King Henry VIII of England, already in the late Middle Ages, suffered terribly from gout in his final years, partly due to a diet that regularly consisted of multiple dishes of red meat, abundant poultry, and epic quantities of wine and beer. Obesity among medieval nobility was another growing problem, though it was sometimes interpreted positively as a sign of prosperity and success. In an era where hunger was a constant threat to the lower classes, having extra weight demonstrated that you had resources to never go hungry. Portraits of nobles often showed them with round faces and robust bodies, signaling wealth. But medieval obesity, caused by a diet rich in fatty meat, white breads, and sweets, brought the same cardiovascular problems we see today. Examinations of skeletal remains of nobles reveal evidence of arteriosclerosis, diabetes, and other metabolic problems that sound strangely familiar to contemporary physicians. Think of modern American barbecues where mountains of hamburgers, ribs, sausages, and steaks cover the grills, where eating until you can't anymore is seen as the event's success. Think of the all-you-can-eat meat restaurants that offer unlimited meats as their main attraction. Think of high-protein diets that promise weight loss through massive consumption of meat while eliminating carbohydrates. Are we really so evolved beyond the medieval mindset that equated meat with status and success? Or have we simply democratized what was once a deadly privilege of the rich, making carnivorous excesses accessible to the masses and creating health epidemics on a scale that medieval people could never imagine? Imagine waking on a cold winter morning in medieval England, the first rays of sun barely illuminating the mist that covers the muddy fields. You're thirsty, your throat dry after a night's sleep in a room without adequate heating. Instinctively, you would reach for a glass of fresh water, right? Wrong. In the Middle Ages, from small children to the elderly, the standard beverage consumed from breakfast onward was beer. Not the strong, hoppy beer we know today, but a weaker version called small ale or small beer, with an alcohol content between 2 and 3%. Pure water was viewed with suspicion, considered potentially poisonous or disease-causing, especially in urban areas. And curiously, this fear had a real basis. Medieval city water was often contaminated with human and animal waste, making it literally more dangerous than beer. The reason beer was safer than water reveals a brilliant accident of medieval chemistry, even though they didn't understand the science behind it. The beer fermentation process involves boiling water during malt production, effectively killing pathogenic bacteria. Furthermore, the alcohol produced during fermentation and the acidic environment created by yeast inhibited the growth of harmful organisms. A medieval child drinking small ale at breakfast was, unknowingly, consuming a beverage that had been sterilized during its production. Meanwhile, water from urban wells and rivers often carried typhoid, dysentery, cholera, and a variety of intestinal parasites that caused regular suffering and death, especially during epidemic outbreaks that swept through medieval cities with terrifying frequency. The amount of beer consumed daily by an average medieval person is absolutely surprising by modern standards. Records from monasteries, manorial estates, and even medieval prisons show beer rations that varied between 1 and 2 gallons per day per adult, approximately 4 to 8 liters daily. Manual laborers who performed strenuous physical work all day received even more. Of course, small ale had far less alcohol than modern beers, but it still represented constant alcohol intake throughout the entire day, every day, from childhood until death. There was no concept of alcohol-free days, nor concern about the cumulative effects of this constant exposure on the liver, brain, and other organs. Can you imagine a society where 5-year-old children regularly drink beer, where teachers provide beer to students during classes, where monks and nuns consume beer as part of their daily religious routines? That was medieval reality. It wasn't considered child abuse or irresponsibility. It was simply the safest way to keep people hydrated. Modern studies on brain development show that exposure to alcohol during childhood can have lasting effects on cognition, impulse control, and emotional development. The entire medieval population was essentially in a state of continuous mild intoxication, with consequences that were never fully understood or studied. But it wasn't just weak beer that flowed abundantly. The nobility and those with resources consumed wines, meads, and stronger beers in quantities that today we would classify as severe alcoholism. Noble banquets could serve liters of wine per guest, with social expectation to drink generously and frequently. Refusing wine was an insult to the host. Elaborate toasts and endless rounds guaranteed that cups were constantly refilled. Medieval chroniclers describe banquets where guests became so drunk they had to be carried to their chambers, or where violent fights erupted between nobles whose judgment was completely compromised by alcohol. Medieval wine was fundamentally different from modern wines in several important ways. First, it was often not fully clarified, containing sediments and sometimes having an almost cloudy texture. Second, its quality varied wildly. Fine wines imported from Burgundy or Bordeaux were one thing, but cheap local wines could be so sour and unpleasant that they needed to be heavily spiced with spices, honey, and even medicinal herbs to become palatable. Third, without modern preservatives like sulfites, medieval wine soured quickly, transforming into vinegar. This led to the development of spiced wines, or Hippocratic wines. Wines mixed with honey, cinnamon, ginger, cloves, and other spices, heated and consumed hot, especially in winter. These beverages were considered medicinal, in addition to being pleasurable. The connection between alcohol and medieval medicine was deep and complex. The word whiskey comes from the Gaelic wishe beitha, which means water of life, a name that reveals how alcoholic distillates were viewed as almost magical elixirs. Physicians prescribed wine for practically every condition: general weakness, digestive problems, melancholy, fevers, and even to aid recovery from surgery. Medicinal herbs were often macerated in wine or strong beer to extract their healing properties, creating tinctures that were simultaneously medicine and alcoholic beverage. Hospitals and monasteries with infirmaries maintained substantial wine stocks specifically for medicinal purposes. The line between medical treatment and recreational consumption was practically non-existent. Compare this to the modern United States, where alcoholism affects approximately 14.5 million adults, according to data from the National Institute on Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism, where binge drinking culture on university campuses is simultaneously celebrated in movies and lamented by health professionals, where craft distilleries and breweries multiply rapidly, transforming alcohol consumption into a sophisticated hobby and symbol of cultural refinement, where wine mom culture normalizes daily wine consumption as a coping mechanism for parental stress. Have we really overcome medieval dependence on alcohol, or have we simply repackaged it with more sophisticated marketing and more elaborate denial? Mead deserves special attention in this medieval alcoholic story. Made by fermenting diluted honey in water with the addition of natural yeasts, mead was considered the oldest and noblest beverage, with roots reaching back to pre-Christian cultures. In Norse mythology, mead was the drink of the gods, conferring wisdom and poetic power. In medieval practice, it was a strong, sweet, and potent beverage that could reach alcohol contents of 15 to 20%, similar to modern fortified wines. Mead halls were social centers where warriors, nobles, and visitors gathered to drink, tell stories, and establish alliances. The custom of the honeymoon comes from the medieval tradition of gifting newlyweds with enough mead to last a complete lunar cycle, believing it would promote fertility and marital happiness. The distillation of alcohol arrived in Europe during the Middle Ages, probably brought through contact with the Islamic world, where alchemists had developed distillation techniques for medicinal and perfumery purposes. The first European distillates were called aqua vitae, water of life, and were initially sold exclusively by apothecaries as powerful medicine. Physicians believed that distillates could cure practically anything, from colds to plagues. This water of life was so strong, often 60% alcohol or higher, that it was consumed in small doses, sometimes mixed with water, spices, or sugar. Gradually, the consumption of distillates migrated from strictly medicinal to recreational, establishing the foundation for the culture of distilled beverages that would fully develop in the following centuries. Public drunkenness was surprisingly tolerated in medieval society, at least among men of certain social standing. While the Church preached moderation and condemned gluttony and drunkenness as sins, in practice there was broad cultural acceptance that men would get drunk regularly, especially during festivals, religious celebrations, and fairs. Medieval laws generally differentiated between simple drunkenness, getting drunk but relatively harmless, and criminal drunkenness, committing crimes while drunk. A drunk who simply staggered through the streets or slept in ditches rarely faced serious consequences. But if he committed violence, theft, or blasphemy while drunk, penalties could be severe, although alcohol rarely served as a legal defense. Medieval taverns were central institutions of urban community life, serving functions that went far beyond simply providing drink. They were meeting places, centers of news and gossip, places where business was conducted and deals closed. Travelers found accommodation in taverns, merchants conducted their transactions in tavern corners, and workers spent their evenings after long days drinking and socializing. But taverns were also places of danger. Violent fights were common. Gambling led workers to lose their wages. Prostitution often operated in connection with taverns, and diseases spread easily in cramped, poorly ventilated spaces filled with sweaty bodies and spilled drinks. The quality of medieval alcohol varied so dramatically that poisoning from adulterated beverages was a real and recurring problem. Unscrupulous brewers and tavern keepers sometimes excessively diluted their beverages, added questionable ingredients to increase volume or potency, or sold products that had soured or become contaminated. Municipal regulations attempted to control quality, with official inspectors, ale tasters in England, responsible for testing beer and wine in commercial establishments and punishing dishonest sellers. Punishments could include heavy fines, public destruction of the bad product, or even sentencing to the pillory, a form of public humiliation where the offender was locked in a wooden structure in the market square while citizens threw garbage and insults. There were also fermented beverages beyond beer, wine, and mead that reveal medieval creativity and sometimes desperation. Perry was made from fermented pears, popular in regions where pears grew abundantly. Cider, made from apples, was especially popular in areas like Normandy and parts of England. Braggot was a hybrid mixture of beer and mead. When crops failed or traditional ingredients became scarce, people fermented practically anything containing sugar, beets, turnips, even tree sap. Some of these improvisations were palatable, others were apparently horrible, but the impulse to create alcohol remained constant even in difficult times. The long-term health effects of this culture of continuous alcohol consumption are difficult to trace with precision in medieval records, but hints exist. Cirrhosis of the liver certainly existed, though it wasn't understood as an alcohol-related disease. Cognitive and memory problems associated with chronic alcoholism probably affected many, but would be attributed to other causes: demonic possession, humoral imbalance, or simply premature old age. Medieval life expectancy was already short due to multiple factors, so isolating the specific impact of alcohol would be practically impossible. But when we consider an entire population consuming alcohol daily from childhood until death, it's inevitable to conclude that this was a significant factor in the overall health of medieval society. Think of the irony: medievals drank beer because water was dangerous, creating a solution that solved an immediate problem of waterborne diseases, but created a slow epidemic of chemical dependence and organ damage that affected generations. Today, we have clean, safe water available in abundance in developed nations, yet alcohol consumption remains robust, now purely by recreational and social choice. How many of your decisions about alcohol are really free, and how many are cultural conditioning as deep as the medieval child automatically reaching for his cup of small ale upon waking? The substance may be the same, but have the reasons really changed so much? Fat in the Middle Ages was not merely a culinary ingredient, it was a symbol of wealth, a vehicle for flavor, and, according to the medical beliefs of the time, an essential component for health and vitality. Imagine the kitchens of medieval castles where enormous iron cauldrons hung over constant fires, filled with boiling pork lard that bubbled and crackled, waiting to receive pieces of meat, bread dough, vegetables, or practically anything the cooks decided to fry. The smell of hot fat permeated not just the kitchens, but entire corridors, impregnating clothes, hair, and the very stone of the walls. For medieval nobility, a meal without abundant fat was considered inadequate, almost insulting, like serving peasant food to someone who deserved luxury. The lustrous texture, the oily sheen on the surface of dishes, the satisfying weight of food drenched in fat, all of this communicated abundance and generosity. Pork lard was the supreme fat of the medieval European kitchen, especially in northern regions where Mediterranean olive oil was expensive and scarce. When a pig was slaughtered, a significant event that usually happened in autumn before winter, when feeding the animal would become difficult, every gram of fat was carefully collected, melted, and stored in ceramic pots or animal bladders. This creamy white fat served multiple purposes: cooking base, meat preservative, ingredient in medicines and ointments, and even fuel for lamps in desperate times. Peasant families who owned a fat pig were considered fortunate, as the lard would sustain them through the cold months when fresh food was scarce and caloric energy was a matter of survival. Medieval frying methods were fundamentally different and often more dangerous than our modern techniques. There were no thermometers to measure oil temperature, no precise heat controls, no scientific understanding of smoke point, or the toxic compounds formed when fat is superheated. Cooks simply heated the fat until it seemed right, usually testing by tossing a piece of bread and observing how it fried. If the bread browned quickly, the temperature was adequate, but often the fat was heated far beyond the necessary point, creating acrid smoke and compounds like acrolein, which not only irritated eyes and lungs, but were also potentially carcinogenic. Medieval cooks frequently suffered from chronic respiratory problems, persistent cough, and irritated eyes, conditions that were accepted as a normal part of the profession. Have you ever stopped to think about how many fried foods you consume in a typical week? French fries from fast food, fried chicken, donuts, nuggets, onion rings, tempura, chicharrones, churros. The list is extensive and culturally omnipresent. The American Heart Association recommends severely limiting consumption of fried foods due to cardiovascular risks, but studies show that the average American consumes fried meals several times a week. A study published in the British Medical Journal in 2019 found that eating fried foods daily increased the risk of premature death by 14%. The contemporary obsession with fried food echoes directly the medieval fascination with fat, only democratized and industrialized on a scale that would make a medieval cook simultaneously envious and horrified. The reuse of fat for frying was standard medieval practice that multiplied health risks. Fat was too expensive to discard after a single use, so the same pot of lard could be used repeatedly over days or even weeks, with new fat added as levels dropped. Each heating cycle chemically degraded the fat, producing toxic aldehydes, ketones, and free fatty acids. Food particles that sank to the bottom of the pot gradually carbonized, releasing even more harmful compounds. The fat became progressively darker, more viscous, and more rancid, developing unpleasant flavors that were partially masked by liberal use of spices. When finally the fat became inedible even by tolerant medieval standards, it was sometimes sold to lower classes or used for non-culinary purposes like soap making or lubrication. The fritters, or fried foods of medieval times, were a vast category of foods that demonstrated the versatility and creativity and dangers of fried cooking. Practically any ingredient could be coated in batter made from flour, eggs, and sometimes beer, then plunged into boiling fat. Pieces of meat, fish, fruits, vegetables, flowers, even herbs were transformed into fritters. Friteurs, vendors specialized in fried foods, circulated through medieval markets and fairs, carrying portable cauldrons heated by coals, frying and selling hot snacks to hungry crowds. The smell of fritters permeated public spaces, attracting customers but also contributing to urban air pollution that made medieval cities suffocating and smoky places. Butter, though less common than lard in many regions, had its own important and problematic role in the medieval diet. Produced by churning fresh cream until the fat separated, butter was perishable and soured quickly without adequate refrigeration. This led to the development of salted butter, heavily salted butter for preservation, resulting in a product that was simultaneously fatty and loaded with sodium. In Scandinavian and Northern European regions where dairy production was more developed, butter buried in peat bogs, bog butter, was discovered by archaeologists centuries later, preserved by the anaerobic environment but having developed pungent flavors and rancidity that make us question how it was when fresh and whether it really improved food or simply added precious calories. Compare medieval oil reuse practices with modern fast food restaurant deep fryers. Health regulations now require regular oil changes and monitoring of its degradation, but economic reality pressures establishments to maximize the use of each batch of oil. Quick tests measure the presence of polar compounds, indicators of oil degradation, but not all restaurants follow protocols rigorously. Journalistic investigations periodically expose establishments using oil far beyond its safe point. oil that is dark brown, foamy, and filled with carbonized particles. Technology has advanced, but the economic impulse to extract maximum value from expensive resources remains constant, as do the resulting public health risks. Tallow, fat from beef or sheep, was another common fat in the medieval kitchen, especially in regions where pigs were less prevalent. Tallow had a higher melting point than lard, making it more suitable for certain types of frying and for making candles. But it also had a stronger flavor, sometimes described as meaty or gamey, which wasn't always desirable in sweet dishes. Medieval bakers developed elaborate recipes that balanced tallow's strong flavor with sweet spices, dried fruits, and honey. The famous mincemeat pies, pies of minced meat that still appear in British Christmas celebrations, originally contained beef fat mixed with dried fruits, spices, and small amounts of meat, creating a combination that to modern palates seems strange, but that was celebrated in medieval times. Goose and duck fat were considered superior and were reserved for special occasions or particularly refined dishes. These birds accumulated generous layers of fat that were carefully harvested during preparation. Goose fat had a silky consistency and delicate flavor that made it ideal for frying potatoes, a technique that would fully develop only centuries later with the introduction of potatoes from the Americas, but that was already applied to root vegetables like turnips and parsnips in the Middle Ages. Confit, the technique of cooking meat slowly in its own melted fat, and then storing it covered in that fat, was developed as a preservation method that created exceptionally tender texture, but also resulted in dishes extremely rich in calories and saturated fat. There was also a curious religious dimension to fat consumption. During Lenten fasting periods, when animal products were prohibited, a lucrative trade in butter dispensations emerged. Paid permissions from the church that allowed the consumption of butter and other animal fats during Lent. This practice was particularly strong in northern European regions where vegetable alternatives to fat were scarce and expensive. Wealthy families paid substantial fees to obtain these dispensations, while the poor were forced to subsist on simpler preparations using inferior vegetable oils or simply food cooked or roasted without additional fat. The famous butter tower of Rouen Cathedral in France was supposedly financed by these butter dispensation fees, a literal monument to the intersection of religion, commerce, and questionable eating habits. The health effects of a diet rich in saturated fats and fried foods were observed by medieval physicians, but interpreted through the lens of humoral theory that dominated medical thinking. Obesity was often seen as an excess of phlegm or moisture, treated with purgatives, bloodletting, and diets that ironically sometimes included more roasted meat, considered dry and therefore balancing. Digestive problems caused by excess fat were attributed to imbalances that needed to be corrected with hot spices or medicinal beverages. The idea that fat itself could be the problem, that arteries could be blocked by cholesterol deposits, that the heart could be overburdened by an excessively rich diet, all of this was centuries in the future. Medieval pies deserve special mention as vehicles for exceptional fat. But we're not talking about the delicate pies with flaky crust and balanced fillings we know today. Medieval pies often had thick, dense crusts called coffins, a term that originally simply meant box or container, but that has sinister resonance when considering its contents. These crusts were made with massive proportions of fat to flour, creating structures that were almost impermeable and could contain liquid or semi-liquid fillings for long periods. Many of these crusts weren't even meant to be eaten. They were simply edible cooking containers that could be removed before serving. But among the nobility, eating the fat-rich crust was a sign of appreciation for the baker's work and a demonstration that you could consume extravagant calories without concern. Cooking methods that didn't involve frying also frequently depended on generous fat. Medieval roasts were typically basted repeatedly with melted fat during cooking. a process called basting that kept the meat moist but also saturated it with even more fat. Rich stews and soups often had visible layers of fat floating on the surface, considered the most flavorful and nutritious part. Pottage, the thick stew that was staple food for peasants, was infinitely better when a piece of bacon or a spoonful of lard was added, transforming simple vegetables and grains into a satisfying meal that provided crucial calories for strenuous physical work. There is something profoundly primal in human attraction to fatty food. From an evolutionary perspective, fat is a dense and efficient energy source, providing 9 calories per gram compared to 4 for carbohydrates and proteins. For our ancestors living in environments where calories were scarce and physical work was intense, consuming fat when available was an intelligent survival strategy. The problem arises when this evolved preference is placed in a modern environment of caloric abundance and sedentary lifestyle. Medieval people at least burned many of the calories from fat through constant physical work, construction, agriculture, travel on foot, manual labor. We've maintained the love of fat, but eliminated the need to burn it, creating a dangerous metabolic incompatibility. Think of air fryer deep fryers that became a sales phenomenon in recent years, promising fried food with little or no additional fat. Think of the growing market for fat substitutes, healthier vegetable oils, and cooking techniques that attempt to capture the sensory pleasure of frying without the consequences. We're essentially trying to trick our medieval brains, providing the sensations they crave, crispness, richness, satisfaction, without the burden of saturated fat and calories. But can we really have both? Or are we simply moving between extremes from boiling medieval lard to modern healthy coconut oil, always searching for the magical fat that will let us eat without consequences? Salt in the Middle Ages occupied a paradoxical and profoundly contradictory position. It was simultaneously the most essential preserver of life and a silent killer that corroded human health grain by grain, meal after meal, year after year. Imagine the storage rooms of medieval castles where sacks of coarse, crystalline salt were guarded as carefully as gold and silver, protected by locks and guards. Without refrigeration, without freezing, without the modern preservation techniques we take for granted, salt was literally the difference between surviving the winter and starving to death when harvests ended and snow covered the fields. Each white crystal carried this duality, promise of preserved food and, simultaneously, slow contribution to hypertension, kidney problems, and a variety of cardiovascular conditions that medievals couldn't connect to their most precious seasoning. Salt extraction in the Middle Ages was a massive and often brutal industry. There were 3 main methods: mining salt from underground deposits, evaporating seawater in coastal salt pans, and boiling salt water from natural springs. Each method had its specific dangers. In salt mines, like the famous Wieliczka mines in Poland or Hallstatt in Austria, workers descended hundreds of meters underground, breathing humid air saturated with salt particles that damaged their lungs, digging tunnels that could collapse at any moment. In coastal salt pans of the Mediterranean and Atlantic, workers stood under scorching sun for endless hours, suffering severe dehydration, ironically surrounded by salt that extracted moisture from everything it touched. The salt that reached medieval tables was literally soaked in human sweat, blood, and suffering. The economic value of salt was so immense that it controlled trade routes and determined the fate of entire cities. The famous salt roads, networks of commercial routes that crisscrossed Europe, were vital arteries of commerce where caravans transported salt from production areas to inland regions. Cities strategically located along these routes prospered by charging passage fees and providing services to merchants. Some cities, like Salzburg, literally Salt Castle, in Austria, owed their entire existence to the salt trade. Kings and feudal lords instituted heavy taxes on salt. The infamous gabelle in medieval France was so hated that it would contribute centuries later to fueling the resentment that culminated in the French Revolution. Controlling salt was controlling the life and death of the population. Do you know the numbers about modern sodium consumption? The American Heart Association recommends no more than 150 milligrams of sodium per day for most adults, approximately 3/4 of a teaspoon of salt. But the average American consumes more than 3,400 milligrams daily, more than double the recommended amount. Studies estimate that this excess sodium contributes to approximately 500,000 deaths annually in the United States related to cardiovascular disease and stroke. In the Middle Ages, especially during the long winter months when fresh foods were unavailable, people consumed even more extreme levels of salt through preserved meats, salted fish, and pickled vegetables. The critical difference was that medievals had no choice. It was salt or starvation. We have choice, yet we continue consuming dangerous levels out of convenience, taste, and deeply ingrained cultural habit. Medieval salting techniques were extensive and demonstrated remarkable ingenuity in the face of severe technological limitations. To preserve pork, the most commonly salted meat, the slaughtered animal was completely covered in coarse salt, layer after layer, until every surface was encrusted with white crystals. The salt extracted moisture from the meat through osmosis, creating an environment hostile to bacteria that would cause decomposition. After weeks in this state, the meat was removed, rinsed, but never completely free of salt, and hung to dry in cool, well-ventilated spaces. The final product was so salty that biting directly into it would be almost impossible. It needed to be desalted by soaking in water for hours or even days before cooking. Even after this process, the meat retained intensely salty flavor that dominated any dish. Salted cod deserves special attention as a medieval preservation phenomenon that shaped the economies and diets of entire continents. Beginning in the 12th and 13th centuries, fishermen from Norway, Iceland, and eventually distant Newfoundland developed a massive industry of catching and preserving cod. The fish was split, opened like a book, and completely covered in salt or simply dried in the cold Arctic air. Stockfish, dried cod without salt, became so hard that it needed to be beaten with hammers before cooking. Klipfisk, salted and dried cod, had slightly softer texture but was equally laden with salt. These products could last years without refrigeration, making them ideal for long sea voyages and for inland populations far from the sea. But the cost in sodium was enormous. The religious fasting periods in the Middle Ages, when meat was prohibited, created massive demand for salted fish. During Lent, Fridays, and other days of abstinence that totaled approximately 1/3 of the year, even modest families needed to find alternatives to meat. Salted fish was an accessible solution, but it also meant consecutive weeks of an extremely high sodium diet. Imagine consuming salted cod, salted herring, salmon in brine, day after day, meal after meal. Without modern understanding of blood pressure or cardiovascular health, medievals simply accepted frequent headaches, swelling, and other symptoms of excessive sodium consumption as a normal part of life. Pickled vegetables represented another significant source of salt in the medieval diet. Cabbage became sauerkraut, fermented in brine. Cucumbers were transformed into pickles. Beans, onions, beets, turnips, practically any vegetable left over from harvest was preserved in salt for consumption during winter. The lactic acid fermentation that occurred during this process had probiotic benefits that medievals didn't understand but instinctively valued. Fermented vegetables were easier to digest and seemed alive in ways that simply cooked vegetables were not. But again, the price was extremely high sodium content. A typical serving of medieval pickled vegetables could contain more sodium than the entire modern recommended daily intake. Compare this to the aisles of modern American supermarkets, where ultra-processed foods dominate the shelves. Canned soups with 800 milliliters of sodium per serving, frozen meals with over 1,000 milliliters, snacks, processed meats, cheeses, commercial breads, all loaded with salt that serves simultaneously as preservative, flavor enhancer, and texture agent. The food industry discovered that cheap salt can compensate for inferior ingredients, making mediocre food seem palatable. Studies show that when companies try to reduce salt, sales drop because consumers actually prefer the flavors they've become accustomed to, palates literally conditioned to salt levels that are slowly killing us. Are we really more enlightened than our medieval ancestors, or have we simply replaced the need for preservation with industrial convenience? There was also the phenomenon of salting out, when foods were so heavily salted that salt began to crystallize on the surface or within the product. Extremely salted meats could develop white crusts of pure salt crystals. This wasn't seen as a problem, it was proof that preservation was working effectively. The more salt, the better the preservation, and the better the guarantee that the food would survive months of storage. Toxicologically, this created situations where a single meal could contain multiple grams of salt, levels that would cause acute discomfort even in people accustomed to salty diets. Salt also played an important role in medieval rituals and superstitions that reveal its cultural importance. Spilling salt was considered terrible bad luck, possibly originating from the fact that salt was too expensive to waste. Salt was used in baptism ceremonies representing purification. Merchants closed deals by sharing bread and salt as a symbol of trust and the durability of the agreement. Sharing salt created an almost sacred bond. There are records of salt being used as partial payment of wages. The origin of the term salary comes from the Latin salarium, related to salt. This symbolic dimension of salt demonstrates how central it was not only to physical survival but to the entire social and economic structure of medieval life. The health effects of excessive salt consumption were observable but poorly understood. Medieval physicians noted that people who ate a lot of salted meat frequently became excessively thirsty, developed swelling in their ankles and feet, and suffered from persistent headaches. But humoral medical theory attributed these symptoms to imbalances that needed to be treated with bloodletting, purgatives, or dietary adjustments that frequently made little sense from a modern perspective. The connection between salt and elevated blood pressure, between blood pressure and risk of stroke and heart attack, between sodium consumption and kidney overload, this entire causal chain was completely beyond the reach of medieval medical knowledge. Curiously, there were also cases of salt deficiency that created opposite problems. Agricultural workers who sweated intensely during long days under the summer sun could lose so much salt through perspiration that they developed hyponatremia, dangerously low sodium levels in the blood. Symptoms included extreme weakness, confusion, seizures, and even death in severe cases. The medieval solution was often intuitive. Workers learned to consume additional salt during periods of intense work in hot weather. Some cultures developed specific salty beverages to replenish lost electrolytes. So salt occupied this complete spectrum, from fatal deficiency to chronic toxicity, with most people navigating blindly between the extremes. The different types and qualities of salt available in the Middle Ages also had health implications. Sea salt, evaporated from ocean water, contained traces of minerals like magnesium, calcium, and potassium that provided modest nutritional benefit. Rock salt mined from deposits was often purer, almost pure sodium chloride, but could contain impurities depending on the source. Lower quality salt was sometimes contaminated with earth, sand, or even heavy metals. The whitest and most refined salt was reserved for noble tables, while grey and coarse salt went to food preservation and consumption by the lower classes. these quality variations meant that salt consumption experiences were very different depending on social class. Coastal salt pans created distinctive landscapes that can still be seen in some European regions, vast expanses of shallow pools where seawater was channeled and left to evaporate under the sun. The work of collecting salt from these pools was backbreaking labor, usually performed by seasonal workers who migrated to coastal regions during summer months. These workers lived in primitive conditions, exposed to the elements, earning minimal wages while producing a commodity that was sold at much higher prices inland. The economy of salt, like so many others in the Middle Ages, was built on the exploitation of vulnerable workers. Think of the final irony. Medievals consumed excessive salt because it was essential for preservation, a matter of survival. We consume excessive salt out of convenience, sensory pleasure, and cultural habit when we have dozens of preservation methods available. We have refrigerators, freezers, modern canning, vacuum packaging, freeze-drying, irradiation, an arsenal of technologies that make heavy salting completely unnecessary. Yet we choose foods that poison us slowly in the same way salt poisoned our ancestors. They had the excuse of necessity. What is ours? If you're fascinated by these stories of how our ancestors lived, ate, and survived in ways that seem simultaneously ingenious and terrible, you won't want to miss any episode. Each story we create dives deep into different aspects of medieval life that reveal as much about them as about ourselves. Subscribe to Sleeping Times now and turn on notifications to be the first to receive each new chapter of this journey through time. There's so much more to discover together, and your presence in this community of nocturnal, curious minds makes each episode more meaningful. Shall we continue exploring the past to better understand our present? Spices in the Middle Ages were not simply culinary ingredients, they were status symbols, so potent that wars were fought for their control, empires were built upon their trade, and noble families ruined their fortunes pursuing these aromatic powders that came from lands so distant they seemed mythical. Imagine the excitement of a medieval noble opening a small silk pouch containing black pepper from India, cinnamon from the distant island of Ceylon, or nutmeg from the Molucca Islands, aromas so intense and exotic that they instantly transformed the environment around them. These spices were literally weighed on jewelers' scales, sold at prices equivalent to months of a common worker's salary. But behind the fascination and prestige lay a darker side. The indiscriminate and excessive use of spices not only masked food of questionable quality, but also introduced substances that in typical medieval quantities could have toxic and consciousness-altering effects that no one fully understood. The journey of spices from their exotic origins to European tables was epic in scale and human cost. Arab merchants dominated the land routes from Asia to the Middle East, jealously guarding the secrets of spice origins to maintain monopoly and high prices. Caravans of camels crossed brutal deserts, facing bandits, sandstorms, and deadly thirst. Ships crossed the Indian and Mediterranean Oceans, risking storms, piracy, and diseases that decimated crews. Each intermediary along this chain added their profit margin so that when pepper finally arrived in London or Paris, its price had been multiplied hundreds of times compared to the original cost. Spices were so valuable that they were frequently given as marriage dowries, used to pay debts, and included in wills as precious inheritance. Black pepper, Piper nigrum, was the undisputed queen of medieval spice trade. Originating from the coast of Malabar in India, this small dried drupe was so valued that expensive as pepper became a common expression. But did you know that excessive pepper can have significant effects on the digestive system? Piperine, the compound that gives pepper its characteristic pungent taste, is an irritant to mucous membranes. Consumed moderately, it can stimulate digestion and even have beneficial antimicrobial properties. But in the generous quantities used in medieval noble dishes, Where pepper was added not with pinches but with spoonfuls, it could cause severe gastric irritation, exacerbate undiagnosed ulcers, and contribute to chronic acid reflux that medievals attributed to excess bile or other humoral imbalances. Medieval cinnamon presents a fascinating mystery and a real toxicological danger. There were two main types: true cinnamon, Cinnamomum verum, from Ceylon, and cassia, Cinnamomum cassia, from China. Cassia was cheaper, more widely available, and had a stronger, sweeter flavor than true cinnamon. The problem? Cassia contains significantly high levels of coumarin, a compound that in high doses is hepatotoxic. It damages the liver. Medieval Europeans, without the ability to chemically distinguish between the two types and frequently receiving cassia when they paid prices for true cinnamon, consumed this spice in quantities we would today consider alarming. Spiced wines, cinnamon sweets, meats covered with cinnamon powder, all contributed to cumulative exposure to coumarin that, over years or decades, could silently damage liver function. Nutmeg deserves special attention as one of the most dangerous spices when consumed in excess. Myristica fragrans produces both nutmeg and mace, the red covering around the seed, both highly valued in medieval times. But nutmeg contains myristicin, a compound with psychoactive properties. In small doses, a pinch in a dish, it's perfectly safe and delicious. But consume the equivalent of 1 or 2 whole nutmegs and you'll experience nausea, dizziness, hallucinations, heart palpitations, and even seizures in extreme cases. There are ambiguous historical records of medieval nobles experiencing visions or disturbances of mind after particularly spiced feasts. They could be attributed to demonic possession or humoral imbalance, but in some cases they were probably literal nutmeg intoxication. Cloves, Syzygium aromaticum, came from the Molucca Islands, so remote that Europeans wouldn't discover their exact location until the 16th century, after Magellan's expedition. Medievals paid fortunes for these dried flower buds without knowing where they grew. Clove oil contains eugenol, which has anesthetic and antiseptic properties, which is why it's still used in dentistry. But eugenol in high doses is also toxic, potentially causing liver and kidney damage. Medieval cooks frequently used cloves with a heavy hand, both for their distinctive flavor and to demonstrate wealth. Dishes could contain dozens of whole cloves, and medieval spiced wines often had clove concentrations that would make modern sommeliers recoil in horror. Compare medieval spice use with our contemporary relationship with supplements and superfoods. Turmeric, ginger, cinnamon, the same medieval spices, are now marketed as health supplements, sold in capsules with concentrated dosages that promise everything from inflammation reduction to cancer prevention. The FDA regularly receives reports of liver damage associated with high-dose spice supplements. We're committing the same medieval error, assuming that if some is good, more is better, only now with scientific packaging and wellness marketing. The phrase natural doesn't mean safe applied as much to the medieval kitchen as to the supplement aisle of the modern health food store. Saffron, dried stigmas from the Crocus sativus flower, was perhaps the most expensive spice of all, requiring approximately 150,000 flowers to produce 1 kilogram of dried saffron. It was used both as a dye and as a spice, giving dishes a vibrant golden yellow color that was associated with divine light and purity. But saffron also contains bioactive compounds like safranal and crocin that, in very high doses, we're talking quantities that no one would accidentally consume due to cost, can cause serious problems including bleeding and miscarriage. There are historical records of saffron being intentionally used as an abortifacient, and also cases of poisoning when adulterated saffron contained toxic substitutes like red lead used to increase weight and color. Medieval spice powders were complex mixtures that varied from region to region and from cook to cook, but generally included combinations of pepper, ginger, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, cardamom, and sometimes more exotic ingredients like long pepper, piper longum, grains of paradise, Aphramomum melegueta, or even galangal. These mixtures were sprinkled generously over practically any savory or sweet dish. The result was a cacophony of flavors so intense that the natural flavors of the main ingredients were completely masked. To us, accustomed to cuisine that celebrates the natural flavors of ingredients, this seems bizarre. But to medievals, especially those eating preserved or slightly deteriorated meat, this explosion of spices was desirable and even necessary. There was also the question of adulteration and falsification of spices, a problem so serious that severe laws were enacted attempting to control it. Expensive spices were frequently stretched with cheaper additives, pepper mixed with ground juniper seeds, saffron mixed with marigold flowers, or worse, cinnamon cut with sawdust. Some adulterants were relatively harmless, others were directly dangerous. There are records of spices contaminated with toxic substances like lead, used to add weight, or arsenic. Medieval consumers had little ability to verify authenticity or purity of what they bought, especially since many had never seen the original plants and depended entirely on trusting merchants. Medieval medical theories about spices were fascinating and completely without scientific basis, but profoundly influenced how they were used. According to humoral medicine, each spice had hot, cold, dry, or moist properties in varying degrees. Pepper was considered extremely hot and dry, perfect for balancing cold and moist foods like fish. Ginger was hot and dry in the second degree, ideal for digestion. These classifications led cooks to add spices not just for flavor, but for medical reasons, creating combinations that theoretically balanced the humors and promoted health. In reality, they frequently created sensory and chemical bombardments that digestive systems struggled to process. Ginger, Zingiber officinale, deserves special mention as a spice that had both extensive culinary and medicinal uses. It came from tropical Asia and was considered especially valuable for warming the stomach and promoting digestion. Candied ginger, pickled ginger, gingerbread, ginger beer, all were consumed regularly. Ginger truly has scientifically proven anti-nausea properties, so some medieval medicinal uses had merit. But it was also consumed in quantities so large that it could cause heartburn, mouth irritation, and, in extreme cases, interfere with blood clotting, particularly problematic in an era when bloodletting was common medical treatment and wounds could easily become fatal. Spices also played an important role in medieval beverages beyond the spiced wine already mentioned. Hippocras was sweet wine heavily spiced with cinnamon, ginger, and other spices, served at the end of banquets as a digestive. Claret originally referred to wine spiced and clarified with spices. Caudle was a hot beverage made with wine or beer, eggs, sugar, and spices, given to women after childbirth or to sick people. All these beverages delivered concentrated doses of spices in liquid form that was rapidly absorbed, potentially amplifying both beneficial and adverse effects. Think of the paradox: spices that medievals literally killed and died to obtain, crossing oceans, paying fortunes, risking life and treasure, are now available in any supermarket for trivial prices. You can buy a jar of cinnamon for a few dollars. Black pepper is on every restaurant table for free. Nutmeg costs pennies. The complete democratization of products that were once supreme symbols of status. But with this cheap availability, have we also lost the respect and caution? Spices became so common that we forgot they are powerful bioactive substances, not just harmless flavors. And in the modern pursuit of natural and organic, we sometimes assume that if it comes from a plant, it must be completely safe in any quantity. The medieval obsession with spices reveals something profound about human nature: our desire for status, our fascination with the exotic and distant, our willingness to assume risks, both financial and health, for unique sensory experiences. It also reveals how what we consider luxury is cultural and temporally contingent. No medieval noble could imagine a future where spices would be common and cheap, just as perhaps we can't imagine that things we consider essential today might one day become irrelevant or even ridiculous. What are you pursuing today that future generations will look upon with perplexity, unable to understand the appeal? And what price are you paying in health, resources, time for luxuries that may be fundamentally empty? Bread was more than sustenance in the Middle Ages. It was synonymous with life itself, so fundamental that earning one's bread meant working to survive, and breaking bread together created sacred bonds of community. Imagine a medieval peasant family on a cold morning, gathered around a rough wooden table, each member receiving their portion of dark bread that would constitute the majority of their caloric intake for the day. This bread, made from rye, barley, or wheat, depending on the luck of the harvest and social status, was the anchor that kept body and soul together. But hidden within these rustic breads, especially those made from rye, cultivated in damp and cold conditions, occasionally lurked an invisible and terrifying danger: the fungus Claviceps purpurea, known as ergot or rye ergot, which transformed the food of life into a vehicle of madness, horrible hallucinations, gangrene, and agonizing death in episodes that medievals called St. Anthony's fire or hellfire. Ergotism, poisoning by ergot, occurred when rye grains were infected by the fungus during growth in the field. The fungus replaced normal grains with elongated dark purple sclerotia that were ground together with healthy grains into flour. These sclerotia contained powerful alkaloids, including LSD precursors, that caused two main types of ergotism: convulsive and gangrenous. Convulsive ergotism caused painful muscle spasms, seizures, vomiting, and vivid and terrifying hallucinations. Victims reported seeing demons, feeling as though they were being burned alive, or having apocalyptic visions. Gangrenous ergotism restricted blood flow to extremities, causing intense burning sensation, hence fire, followed by tissue necrosis, where entire fingers, hands, feet became black, mummified, and eventually separated from the body. In both cases, the suffering was unimaginable and the mortality rate was high. Ergotism outbreaks swept through medieval communities with disturbing regularity, especially after damp and cool summers that favored fungal growth. In 994 AD, a massive outbreak in France killed approximately 40,000 people. In 1128, another outbreak in Paris killed 14,000. Medieval chroniclers described horrors beyond comprehension: pregnant women spontaneously aborting, children writhing in agony as their bodies twisted into impossible positions, strong men whose limbs rotted and fell off while still alive. Without knowledge of microbiology or toxicology, these epidemics were interpreted as divine punishment, witchcraft, or mass demonic possession. Desperate pilgrimages were made to sanctuaries of saints, especially St. Anthony, begging for cures that rarely came if the victim continued consuming contaminated bread. Can you imagine the absolute helplessness of not understanding what is causing massive suffering in your community, of seeing neighbors and family literally rot alive, go insane, or writhe to death with no rational explanation? Medieval people lived with that terrifying uncertainty. Compare this to our modern fears about food contamination, recalls of E. coli in lettuce, salmonella outbreaks in eggs, listeria in processed meats. When we hear about these recalls, we have tracking systems that rapidly identify the source, regulatory agencies that order market withdrawals, scientific knowledge that explains exactly what's happening. Yet according to the CDC, approximately 48 million Americans get sick from contaminated food annually, 128,000 are hospitalized, and 3,000 die. Our technology has advanced tremendously, but food contamination remains a persistent threat. Ergot wasn't the only fungal danger lurking in medieval grains. Aflatoxins, produced by Aspergillus fungi, that grow on grains stored in damp conditions, are extremely potent carcinogens that cause liver cancer. Ochratoxin, from another common fungus, damages kidneys and is also carcinogenic. Fuminicins, from Fusarium, cause neural tube defects in fetuses and liver and kidney damage. Medieval grain storage, often in damp, poorly ventilated barns infested with rodents, created perfect conditions for fungal proliferation. People consumed these mycotoxins regularly in low doses that didn't cause dramatic acute symptoms, but that cumulatively over decades contributed to cancer, liver and kidney disease, and other chronic conditions that medievals simply accepted as part of aging or bad luck. Grain quality varied dramatically with annual weather conditions and the consumer's social position. In years of good harvest, grains were healthier and more abundant. But after rainy summers or periods of famine when harvests failed, people were forced to consume increasingly poor quality grains, including grains that would normally be discarded or used only as animal feed. Famine bread, made during crises, mixed grain flour with ground husks, acorns, wild herbs, even earth or sawdust to extend the supply. These breads of desperation were practically indigestible, caused severe constipation or diarrhea, and had virtually zero nutritional value, but filled empty stomachs and gave temporary illusion of satiety before hunger returned with vengeance. The grinding process itself introduced additional contaminants. Medieval mills, whether powered by water, wind, or animal force, used massive stones of granite or flint to grind grains. Over time, these stones wore down, releasing particles of stone and sand that mixed into the flour. Consuming this sandy flour over a lifetime caused dramatic wear on teeth. Archaeological evidence shows that medieval teeth were often ground down almost to the gums by decades of chewing sandy bread. This wear exposed the dental pulp, causing intense pain and infections that could spread to the jawbone and even be fatal in an era without antibiotics or modern dentistry. There was also the problem of insect and rodent plagues in stored grains. Weevils, flour beetles, grain moths all regularly infested medieval grain stores. Rats and mice not only ate grains but contaminated them with urine and feces carrying pathogens. The bubonic plague, the Black Death that killed 1/3 of Europe's population in the 14th century, was transmitted by fleas from rats that lived in close proximity to stored grains and humans. Leptospirosis, hantavirus, and other rodent-borne diseases were constant risks. But grains were so precious that even visibly infested grains were often sifted, insects removed as best as possible, and the flour used anyway. Compare medieval grain storage with our modern facilities: climate-controlled silos, regular fumigation, humidity monitoring, mycotoxin testing. The FDA establishes strict limits for acceptable levels of contaminants in commercial grains. And yet problems persist. In 2021, several brands of baby cereal were recalled due to dangerous levels of heavy metals. Studies regularly find mycotoxins at low but detectable levels in commercial grain products. The difference is one of degree, not type. We're still fighting natural forces that want to degrade our food, just with more tools at our disposal. Visible mold on bread was a separate but related issue. Medieval bread, especially in damp climates or during rainy seasons, molded quickly. Attitudes toward moldy bread varied. Some simply scraped off the moldy part and ate the rest. Others consumed the entire bread, mold included, especially if hunger was pressing. Some molds are relatively harmless. Others produce dangerous mycotoxins. The roulette of eating moldy bread meant that occasionally people experienced acute poisoning, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea. but more frequently it was chronic low-level exposure that caused invisible damage over time. There are fascinating and controversial historical theories linking ergotism to specific events in medieval history. Some historians speculate that the Salem witch trials in 1692, technically post-medieval but relevant, may have been partially caused by ergotism, the visions and convulsions of the accusing girls consistent with ergot poisoning. Others suggest that certain medieval ecstatic religious movements, with their visions of saints and demons, may have been influenced by consuming contaminated bread. Episodes of dancing mania, where entire groups of people danced compulsively until collapse, may have an ergotism component. While these theories are debated and impossible to prove definitively, they highlight how the very foundation of the medieval diet could alter consciousness and behavior in profound ways. The poor, as always, suffered disproportionately from grain dangers. Rye, the grain most susceptible to ergot, was mainly consumed by lower classes because it was more resistant to cold climates and poor soils than wheat. Nobles eating white wheat bread were far less likely to encounter ergot. Similarly, the poor had less ability to discard grains of questionable quality or choose the best products at market. They ate what they could afford or grow, and if that meant moldy, fungus-infected or insect-infested grain, there wasn't much choice. Unequal nutrition contributed to dramatic health and longevity differences between classes, another way in which medieval social structure was literally embodied in people's bodies. Medieval bakers, paradoxically, were simultaneously essential and suspect. Strict laws regulated bread price and weight, with severe punishments for cheating bakers. The assize of bread in England mandated fines, pillory, or even banishment for repeat offenders. But bakers still found ways to increase profits, adding cheap fillers to flour, using inferior quality grains, producing breads that were heavy but dense and undercooked in the center. Undercooked bread was not only bad tasting, but also dangerous. Raw flour can carry pathogens, and the undercooked interior of breads provided an environment where bacteria could thrive. The concept of daily bread from the Lord's Prayer had literal and desperate resonance in the Middle Ages. Bread truly was a daily necessity, not a luxury that could be stored for weeks. Fresh bread was best. Yesterday's bread was acceptable. 3-day-old bread was questionable. Beyond that, it was risky. But for many, especially in times of scarcity, there was no choice but to eat what was available, no matter how old, moldy, or suspicious. The alternative was literal starvation, so questionable bread was preferable to no bread. This brutal mathematics of survival meant that health risks were accepted not necessarily out of ignorance, but out of lack of alternatives. Think about how bread, universal symbol of life, sustenance, and even divinity in Christian theology, simultaneously sustained and poisoned medieval people. Something so basic and essential carried invisible dangers that transformed the sacred into the profane, sustenance into poison. And ask yourself, what are our modern equivalents? What basic foods do we consume daily, trusting in their safety, without really knowing what they contain or how they were produced? The pesticides on our vegetables, the antibiotics and hormones in our meat, the preservatives and additives in processed foods, the microplastics found in practically everything. Are we consuming slow poisons while believing we're simply eating our daily sustenance? In 700 years, what will people think of our apparently normal eating practices? Milk in the Middle Ages occupied an ambiguous and dangerous space between nutritious food and potential vehicle of death. Imagine a morning on a medieval farm where a milkmaid with hands dirty from earth and manure sits on a wooden stool beside a cow whose teats are covered in dried mud and feces. Milk spurts into a wooden bucket that was never properly sterilized, just rinsed with cold water from a questionable well. Flies buzz around, landing alternately on the milk, the cow, and the milkmaid's face. This milk, warm from the cow's body, already carrying an invisible load of bacteria, will be consumed raw or transformed into cheese and butter through processes that add more opportunities for contamination. For us, with our understanding of microbial theory and pasteurization practices, this scene is a public health nightmare. For medievals, it was simply normal, Tuesday on the farm. Bovine tuberculosis was one of the most devastating silent killers transmitted through medieval milk. Caused by Mycobacterium bovis, closely related to the bacterium that causes human tuberculosis, this disease regularly infected dairy cattle and was transmitted to humans through consumption of raw milk or fresh cheese. Children were particularly vulnerable, often developing scrofulous tuberculosis, infection that caused massive swelling and suppuration of the neck lymph nodes, creating open draining wounds that permanently disfigured and frequently killed. Called the king's evil because it was believed that a king's touch could cure it, scrofula was so common that royal touching ceremonies were regularly performed, with hundreds of sick people seeking miraculous cures that never came. The real cause, the milk they drank daily, remained completely unsuspected. Brucellosis, caused by Brutella bacteria found in cattle, goats, and sheep, was another milk-borne disease that afflicted medieval populations without being recognized. It caused undulating fevers that came and went for months, debilitating joint pain, extreme chronic fatigue, and in severe cases could affect the heart, liver, and brain. Pregnant women infected often spontaneously aborted, the same effect brucellosis has on livestock, where it causes abortion disease. Without diagnostic tests, brucellosis was indistinguishable from dozens of other feverish conditions that medievals attributed to humoral imbalances, unfavorable astrological influences, or divine punishment. People suffered for months, often becoming permanently weakened, never knowing that the milk from their pet goat or cow was the culprit. Can you comprehend the prevalence of raw milk consumption today, especially in communities that embrace natural and unprocessed foods? Several American states permit raw milk sales, and passionate advocates argue that pasteurization destroys beneficial enzymes and nutrients. The CDC reports that although raw milk represents less than 1% of milk consumed in the US, it is responsible for more than 95% of dairy-borne illnesses. Between 1993 and 2012, there were 197 outbreaks linked to raw milk, resulting in 1,909 illnesses and 144 hospitalizations. The bacteria involved? Campylobacter, E. coli, Listeria, Salmonella, the same ones that terrified medieval consumers. Only now we have the ability to track and name them. The romantic vision of fresh farm milk ignores the bacteriological reality that hasn't changed in 700 years. Medieval cheese production was a fascinating process that involved leaving raw milk in an uncontrolled environment until naturally occurring bacteria, a completely random mixture of whatever was in the air and equipment, fermented and coagulated it. Rennet, enzyme from the stomach of young calves, was added to help with coagulation. The result was cheese that had intense and unpredictable flavors, textures that varied dramatically from batch to batch, and occasionally contained deadly pathogens. Listeria monocytogenes, which causes listeriosis, particularly dangerous for pregnant women, newborns, and the elderly, thrives in cheeses, especially washed rind varieties. Medieval cheeses, made without temperature control, without standardized starter cultures, without understanding of microbiology, were literally unpredictable bacteriological experiments. Some medieval cheeses were aged for long periods, months or years, in damp caves, cellars, or even buried in soil. This aging could improve flavor and texture through the action of beneficial fungi and bacteria, but also created opportunities for harmful organism growth. Hard, well-aged cheeses were generally safer because their low moisture content and acidic pH inhibited pathogens. But fresh, soft cheeses, medieval equivalents of ricotta, cottage cheese, or quark, were consumed days after production and were especially risky. Outbreaks of food poisoning after feasts where fresh cheese was served were so common that they were rarely noted or recorded, just another episode of poor digestion or stomach flux. Medieval butter, already mentioned earlier, presented its own dangers beyond high fat and salt content. The process of making butter, churning cream until the fat separated, was labor-intensive work, usually done in wooden churns that were almost impossible to clean properly. Milk residues became trapped in wood fissures, turning rancid and providing culture medium for bacteria. Each new batch of butter was potentially contaminated by residue from the previous batch. Rancid butter had unpleasant taste and smell, but was often used anyway, especially by poor people who couldn't afford to waste it. Consuming oxidized and rancid fats contributes to oxidative stress in the body, chronic inflammation, and potentially to cardiovascular disease and cancer over a lifetime. Compare medieval dairy processes with modern facilities: mechanical milking with automated cleaning, pasteurization at precisely controlled temperatures, sterile packaging, refrigeration from farm to table, regular pathogen testing, carefully selected bacterial cultures for cheese and yogurt production, and yet dairy recalls for contamination happen regularly. In 2015, Bluebell cheese products were nationally withdrawn after a listeria outbreak that killed 3 people. In 2022, several cheeses were recalled for possible listeria contamination. The difference is that now we have systems to detect and respond to these problems. Medievals simply accepted occasional deaths as mysterious acts of God. There was also the question of dairy adulteration, a practice so common that specific laws were enacted attempting to control it. Dishonest dairymen diluted milk with water to increase volume, sometimes using dirty or contaminated water that introduced new pathogens. Cheeses were stretched with cheap fillers. Butter was mixed with inferior animal fats or even chalk or gypsum to increase weight. These frauds not only financially deceived consumers, but also further compromised the safety of already risky products. Market inspectors tried to detect adulterations through crude tests, but fraudsters frequently stayed one step ahead. Goats and sheep provided alternative milk, especially in regions where cattle were less common. Goat milk has slightly different nutritional composition from cow milk, and some people who are intolerant to cow milk may tolerate it better. But from a food safety perspective, raw goat milk carries similar or even greater risks. Goats can carry Brucella melitensis, which causes a particularly severe form of brucellosis in humans. Q fever, caused by the bacterium Coxiella burnettii, can be transmitted through goat and sheep milk. Toxoplasmosis, especially dangerous for pregnant women, can be transmitted through contaminated goat dairy products. Lactose intolerance, inability to digest milk sugar due to lack of the lactase enzyme, was probably as common in the Middle Ages as it is today, affecting most adults globally, though with significant variation between populations. Northern Europeans developed, through evolutionary pressure, higher rates of lactase persistence into adulthood, allowing them to continue digesting milk after weaning. But even among these populations, many were lactose intolerant and suffered from gas, bloating, cramping, and diarrhea after consuming dairy. Without understanding of enzymes or sugar digestion, these people simply accepted chronic digestive discomfort as a normal part of life, or empirically learned to avoid fresh milk while tolerating aged cheeses and yogurt, where lactose is partially broken down by bacteria. The concept of milk humours in medieval medicine led to curious dietary recommendations. Milk was considered cold and moist, appropriate for children and people with hot and dry constitutions, but potentially harmful for others. Physicians sometimes advised against milk consumption for adults, especially the elderly, fearing it could cause accumulation of phlegm or obstruct the liver. Ironically, this medical suspicion of milk may have inadvertently protected some adults from dairy-borne diseases. When medicine based on false theory occasionally produces the correct result for completely wrong reasons, It's a humbling reminder of how little we understand even when we think we have answers. The seasonality of dairy production created patterns of risk. In spring and summer, when cows grazed in green fields and produced milk abundantly, there was surplus that needed to be preserved through cheese production. But warm temperatures also accelerated bacterial growth, making summer especially risky for dairy-borne illnesses. In winter, milk production dropped dramatically as cows lived on stored hay and their nutrition suffered. Winter dairy was scarce but potentially safer simply because cold temperatures retarded bacterial growth. This seasonal cycle of risky abundance and relative scarcity shaped dietary patterns in ways that medievals recognized empirically without understanding the microbiological reasons. Monasteries and convents developed some of medieval Europe's most sophisticated dairy products. Monks and nuns had the time, resources, and motivation to experiment and refine cheese production techniques. Many famous cheeses, such as Munster, Limburger, and Pont-l'Évêque, originated in monastic contexts. These religious institutions also maintained higher standards of cleanliness and organized processes more systematically than common producers. But even the finest monastic cheeses were made with raw milk in conditions that moderns would consider unhygienic. The difference was one of degree, not type. All medieval dairy carried risks that only luck and the robust constitution of survivors masked. Think of the dairy paradox: food rich in proteins, calcium, and essential fats that sustained civilizations, but also a vector of diseases that killed and debilitated millions. The domestication of livestock and the subsequent human evolutionary adaptation to digest dairy in adulthood was a great civilizational advance. It allowed humans to access calories and nutrients from pasture landscapes that couldn't be cultivated. But this advance came with a deadly cost before the development of microbiology and pasteurization. And today, with all our scientific knowledge, we still passionately debate raw versus pasteurized milk, conventional versus organic dairy, whether adults should consume dairy at all. We solved medieval microbiological dangers only to create new controversies about nutrition, sustainability, and ethics. Will we ever have a clear answer about how we should eat, or does every solution simply create new problems and debates? There is a profound and disturbing irony in the medieval relationship with vegetables and fruits. The foods we now recognize as pillars of a healthy diet were viewed with deep suspicion, often considered foods of the poor, unworthy of refined people, and when consumed by nobility, were usually prepared in ways that destroyed their nutritional benefits or even made them harmful. Imagine a medieval noble looking with disdain at a plate of fresh green vegetables, seeing not nutrition but potential danger. Foods that grew near the ground, touched dirty earth, were watered by unreliable rain, and contained suspicious moistures that could unbalance the delicate humors of the body. While peasants consumed vegetables out of necessity, inadvertently developing diets rich in fiber and nutrients, the elite deliberately avoided them or transformed them through excessive cooking, addition of heavy fats, and bizarre combinations that converted potentially healthy foods into nutritionally impoverished preparations. Medieval medical theory about vegetables and fruits was fundamentally hostile to their consumption, especially raw. Based on the teachings of Galen and other classical physicians filtered through Arab and European interpretations, this theory classified most vegetables as cold and moist, qualities associated with phlegm, the humor considered lowest and least refined. Eating many vegetables, especially raw, supposedly increased phlegm, causing laziness, mental dullness, and excessive mucus production. Fruits were particularly suspect. Physicians believed that raw fruits, especially when eaten on an empty stomach, could putrefy inside the body, causing fevers, diarrhea, and a variety of ailments. This medical pseudoscience gave intellectual justification for dietary practices that deprived people, especially the wealthy, of essential vitamins and nutrients. Scurvy, vitamin C deficiency causing bleeding gums, tooth loss, subcutaneous hemorrhages, and eventually death, was more common than generally recognized in medieval Europe, especially during long winters when fresh vegetables and fruits were unavailable. Sailors on long ocean voyages notoriously suffered from scurvy, but terrestrial populations were also affected, particularly during periods of famine or siege when diets became extremely limited. The connection between lack of fresh vegetables and fruits and scurvy wouldn't be understood for centuries. Medievals interpreted the symptoms as a mysterious disease, possibly divine punishment or the result of corrupted air. The cure was literally growing around them in gardens and fields, leafy green vegetables, cabbage, onions, but medical and cultural prejudice against consuming fresh vegetables meant that many suffered unnecessarily. Are you familiar with modern public health campaigns encouraging consumption of 5 servings of fruits and vegetables a day? CDC data shows that only 12.3% of American adults meet fruit intake recommendations, and only 9.3% meet vegetable recommendations. Despite decades of nutritional education, unprecedented access to fresh produce year-round, and solid scientific knowledge about health benefits, most people still don't eat enough vegetables. But at least we're not actively avoiding vegetables out of medical fear that they're dangerous. Or are we? Consider modern carnivore diets that eliminate vegetables entirely, claiming they're unnecessary or even harmful. Consider distrust of dirty vegetables leading to excessive use of sanitizers and antibacterial washes. Have we really completely overcome medieval anxiety about vegetables? When vegetables were consumed by medieval nobility, they were usually cooked until unrecognizable, boiled for hours until all cellular structure collapsed into amorphous paste. This prolonged cooking destroyed most vitamins, especially heat-sensitive vitamin C and water-soluble B vitamins that leached into cooking water that was then discarded. The result was vegetables that retained fiber but lost most of their nutritional benefits. Furthermore, these excessively cooked vegetables were often served in rich sauces made with butter, cream, or animal fat, and heavily seasoned with expensive spices, transforming what could be a light and healthy dish into a preparation rich in saturated fat and calories. The few vegetables that were valued by the elite tended to be rare or exotic varieties that demonstrated status, not necessarily the most nutritious. Artichokes were considered sophisticated delicacies. Asparagus was valued for its supposed aphrodisiac power. Fresh green peas, available only briefly in spring, were celebrated. But common nutritious vegetables like cabbage, turnips, onions, and leeks were relegated to peasant food status and rarely appeared on noble tables except as soup base or completely hidden in complex dishes. Medieval social hierarchy was reproduced even in vegetable choices, with the most accessible and nutritious foods being socially devalued. Fruits occupied an ambivalent position, desired for their sweetness, but feared for their potential to cause harm. Apples, pears, cherries, plums, and other tree fruits were consumed, but often with caution and in limited quantities. Medieval physicians particularly warned against eating raw fruits at night or on an empty stomach, claiming this would cause harmful vapors or blood corruption. As a result, fruits were often cooked into compotes, baked with honey and spices, or preserved in sugar. Methods that reduced vitamin C content and added substantial calories through added sugars. Fresh, raw fruits, which would have provided maximum nutritional benefit, were precisely the form most avoided. There were also real dangers associated with certain plants that medievals didn't fully understand but recognized empirically. The nightshade family, which includes tomatoes, potatoes, and eggplants, all native to the Americas and not yet introduced to medieval Europe, has European relatives like belladonna, Atropa belladonna, and mandrake, Mandragora officinarum, both extremely poisonous. This association created generalized suspicion of plants with similar characteristics. When potatoes and tomatoes eventually arrived in Europe after 1492, they were initially treated with deep distrust, considered poisonous, and cultivated only as ornamentals. Potato foliage is indeed toxic, and green tomatoes contain alkaloids that can cause digestive discomfort, so the caution had some basis. But this demonstrates how limited empirical knowledge combined with failed medical theory created cultural barriers to adoption of nutritious foods. Legumes, beans, lentils, dried peas, fava beans were staple food for peasants and working classes, providing essential plant protein in diets where meat was rare. But legumes were also socially stigmatized as poor man's food and associated with flatulence and base bodily processes. The nobility generally avoided legumes or consumed them only occasionally during religious fasting periods when protein alternatives were limited. This avoidance of nutritious legumes in favor of excessive meat contributed to the health problems of the elite: gout, obesity, chronic constipation, while peasants eating their bean soups and lentil stews inadvertently consumed more balanced and fiber-rich diets. Compare medieval rejection of legumes for reasons of status with modern eating trends. Clean eating, paleo diets, carnivore movements, all in some way reject or limit legumes, grains, and other plant foods, often with pseudo-scientific justifications about inflammation, lectins, or plant toxins. There's an echo of medieval hierarchy: meat as status food, vegetables as less desirable, though now packaged in language of biohacking and optimization. Meanwhile, nutritional research consistently shows that diets rich in vegetables, fruits, legumes, and whole grains are associated with better health and longevity. Are we repeating medieval errors, just with different rationalizations? The preservation of fruits and vegetables for winter consumption created its own health problems. We've already discussed heavily salted, pickled vegetables. Dried fruits, apples, pears, plums, apricots, were important preservation methods, but the air-drying process exposed fruits to contamination by insects, fungi, and dirt. Dried fruit sometimes developed mold growth that produced mycotoxins. Fruits preserved in honey or sugar were more microbiologically safe, but transformed naturally low-calorie foods into dense sugar concentrates. There was no perfect victory. Fresh fruits and vegetables were distrusted and seasonally unavailable, while preserved versions were safer from microbial contamination, but nutritionally compromised or dangerous in other ways. The herbs growing in medieval gardens, parsley, sage, thyme, rosemary, mint, dill, were used both as seasonings and as medicines. Many of these herbs contain antioxidant and anti-inflammatory compounds that modern nutritionists celebrate. But in the Middle Ages, they were valued for their medicinal effects according to humoral theory: parsley to cleanse the kidneys, sage to strengthen memory, mint to calm the stomach. Some of these applications had real merit, others were completely fictitious, but at least the herbs were consumed regularly and added beneficial phytochemicals to diets, even if for theoretically wrong reasons. There was also the problem of confusion and accidental poisoning with wild plants. Peasants supplemented their diets by foraging wild greens, mushrooms, and other edible plants from fields and forests. This foraging knowledge was generally reliable, passed through generations. But occasionally, mistakes happened. Poisonous mushrooms confused with edible varieties, toxic plants accidentally harvested. Amanita phalloides, the destroying angel, kills through acute liver failure and is often confused with edible mushrooms. Hemlock, Conium maculatum, superficially resembles wild parsley or carrot but contains alkaloids that cause respiratory paralysis and death. These poisonings were rare but occurred regularly enough to add an element of risk to foraging. Monastic gardens represented some of medieval Europe's most sophisticated botanical and horticultural knowledge. Monks and nuns cultivated extensive medicinal gardens with hundreds of plant varieties, kept detailed records of their properties, and developed refined cultivation techniques. The famous 9th century plan of St. Gall shows an elaborate monastic garden divided into sections for vegetables, medicinal herbs, and useful plants. These gardens produced fresher, higher quality food in greater variety than generally available outside monastic contexts. But even with this superior knowledge, the monks still operated within the framework of humoral medical theory and its limitations. The extreme seasonality of vegetable and fruit availability created what we might call seasonal scurvy, vitamin deficiencies that developed during winter and were partially resolved by availability of fresh greens in spring. The first green shoots of spring, young nettles, dandelions, sorrel, were eagerly collected and consumed in soups and salads. Medievals recognized empirically that these spring tonics made people feel better after winter, interpreting this through humoral theory as blood cleansing or purging of winter humors. In reality, they were receiving crucial doses of vitamin C and other nutrients after months of relative deficiency. If only they had understood the mechanism, they could have developed preservation methods that retained vitamins through winter. Think of the absurd abundance of fresh produce available in modern American supermarkets year-round. Strawberries in December, asparagus in February, lettuce from 6 continents available simultaneously. This seasonal cornucopia was made possible through global agriculture, refrigeration, and complex logistics. It freed us from the tyranny of seasonality that forced medievals into cycles of abundance and scarcity. But has it also disconnected us from natural rhythms in ways that have consequences? Studies suggest that globally shipped produce often has inferior nutritional profiles compared to locally grown produce consumed fresh. The convenience of flavorless strawberries in January costs something in terms of nutrition, taste, and environmental impact. And many of us, with unprecedented access to vegetables and fruits, still don't eat them in adequate quantities. The final irony: medieval peasants eating their cabbage soups, lentil stews, dark breads, and foraged wild greens had diets more aligned with modern nutritional recommendations than nobility with their access to rare meats, exotic spices, and elaborate sweets. Poverty forced them to eat in ways we now know to be healthy. Wealth allowed the elite to poison themselves luxuriously. Today, the dynamic has inverted in complex ways. Ultra-processed and caloric foods are cheaper and more accessible, while fresh organic produce and whole foods often cost more and require time and knowledge to prepare. Both yesterday and today, food systems are deeply intertwined with social class and economic power. But have we learned anything about creating systems that make nutritious food accessible and desirable for everyone, or have we simply traded one set of inequalities for another? The medieval kitchen was not the sanitized, organized space we might imagine today, with stainless steel surfaces, clean running water, and clear understanding of cross-contamination and bacterial growth. It was instead a chaotic environment, often suffocating with smoke, where live animals walked freely, where raw meat was cut on the same porous wooden surfaces where bread would be prepared minutes later, where dirty hands touched food without thought of washing, and where the very water used for cleaning was often more contaminated than the dirt it supposedly removed. Imagine a castle kitchen at the height of banquet preparation. Dozens of people working in intense heat, generated by multiple open fires, sweat dripping into cauldrons, blood from freshly slaughtered animals running across stone floors, flies and other insects buzzing incessantly, dogs and cats circulating hoping for scraps, and through it all, the production of elaborate dishes destined for the Lord's table. The conditions that created this spectacular food were simultaneously testimony to human ingenuity and a perfect laboratory for deadly pathogens. The water used in medieval kitchens deserves specific analysis as a fundamental source of contamination. In rural areas, water came from wells, streams, or rivers that often were downstream from other human and animal activities. In cities, the situation was even worse. Urban rivers were simultaneously the source of drinking water and the final destination of human waste, tannery and slaughterhouse waste, and industrial refuse from a variety of trades. The Thames in medieval London was described by chroniclers as fetid and corrupt. The Seine in Paris was no better. Roman aqueducts that once provided clean water to European cities had largely deteriorated or been destroyed during barbarian invasions and wouldn't be adequately rebuilt for centuries. Urban wells, however carefully constructed, were often contaminated by nearby privies whose contents infiltrated through the soil. The pathogens carried by water, cholera, typhoid fever, bacillary, and amoebic dysentery, hepatitis A, poliomyelitis, and dozens of others, killed more people in the Middle Ages than wars. Cholera, caused by the bacterium Vibrio cholerae, could kill within hours through severe dehydration caused by massive, watery diarrhea. Typhoid fever, caused by Salmonella typhi, produced sustained high fever, delirium, and frequently death from intestinal perforation or hemorrhage. Dysentery, whether bacterial or caused by the parasitic amoeba Entamoeba histolytica, caused painful, bloody diarrhea that could persist for weeks, leaving survivors weak and emaciated. None of these diseases was understood as being transmitted by water. They were attributed to bad air, humoral imbalances, unfavorable astrological influences, or divine wrath. The solution was obvious: clean water, but completely invisible without microbial theory. Are you aware that even today, waterborne diseases kill approximately 829,000 people annually worldwide, according to the World Health Organization? Most of these deaths occur in developing countries without adequate water and sanitation infrastructure, essentially replicating medieval conditions. But even in developed countries, outbreaks happen. The Flint, Michigan water crisis exposed thousands of residents to dangerous lead levels through contaminated water. Cryptosporidium, a parasite resistant to chlorination, occasionally contaminates municipal water systems, causing diarrhea outbreaks. Legionella, growing in building water systems, causes severe pneumonia. Our technology has advanced, but the threat of contaminated water remains, and billions of people still live in conditions not much different from medieval times in terms of access to safe water. Food preparation surfaces in medieval kitchens were primarily wood, massive cutting boards, tables, butcher blocks. Wood is porous, absorbing blood, meat juices, and other fluids that become ideal culture media for bacteria. Without hot running water, without antibacterial soap, without understanding of disinfection, these wooden surfaces were simply scraped or rinsed with cold water between uses. Deep grooves and cracks in the wood harbored bacterial colonies that recontaminated each new food prepared. Salmonella from raw chicken, E. coli from beef, listeria from cheese, all thrived on these surfaces and were cheerfully transferred to foods that would be consumed raw or undercooked. Medieval kitchen utensils also presented safety problems beyond simple bacterial contamination. Pots and cauldrons were made from a variety of metals: iron, copper, bronze, copper and tin alloy, and occasionally lead for storage containers or cheap utensils. Cooking acidic foods, vinegar, wine, fruits, in copper or bronze pots could lead to leaching of copper at toxic levels. Acute copper poisoning causes severe nausea, vomiting, and diarrhea. Chronic exposure can damage liver and kidneys. Lead was even more insidious. Lead containers used to store wine or vinegar leached lead in quantities that caused chronic poisoning. Symptoms of lead toxicity include severe abdominal cramps, saturnine colic, constipation, neurological damage leading to cognitive decline, and in severe cases, seizures and death. The famous case of Devonshire colic illustrates dangers of heavy metal contamination even beyond the medieval period. In 18th century Devon, England, an outbreak of severe cramps and paralysis was eventually traced to cider made in presses with lead components. But similar practices existed in the Middle Ages. Sweet wine was sometimes prepared by boiling grape must in lead pots, producing sugar of lead acetate, that sweetened the wine while poisoning it. There is historical speculation that Roman nobility suffered decline due to chronic lead poisoning from wine and water stored in lead containers. Medievals continued many Roman practices without understanding their hidden dangers. Compare medieval food hygiene practices with standards required in modern commercial kitchens: rigorously controlled storage temperatures, strict separation of raw and cooked foods, color-coded cutting boards for different food types, frequent hand-washing with antibacterial soap, regular surface sanitization, thermometers to check internal cooking temperatures, food safety training programs. And yet the CDC estimates that 48 million Americans suffer from foodborne illnesses annually. Despite all knowledge and regulation, food contamination remains surprisingly common. The difference is that now we have systems to track outbreaks, identify sources, and implement recalls, capabilities medievals didn't have, so local outbreaks often went unrecognized or without coordinated response. The storage of food in medieval kitchens and pantries created abundant opportunities for deterioration and contamination. Without refrigeration, perishable foods lasted hours, or at most days. Meat hung on hooks in cool pantries rapidly developed a surface film of bacteria. Dairy soured, bread molded, stored grains attracted rodents and insects. Medievals developed keen senses of smell and sight to assess whether foods were still safe to consume, but these methods were imprecise at best. Meat that smelled a bit strong but not completely putrid was often cooked and served. Slightly sour milk was used in cooking. Grains with visible signs of insect infestation were sifted and used anyway. The pests that infested medieval kitchens were not merely nuisances but vectors of serious diseases. Rats and mice carried not only fleas that transmitted bubonic plague, but also leptospirosis in their urine, hantavirus, and a variety of parasites. Their feces contaminated surfaces and foods. Flies landed alternately on feces, rotting meat, and then on prepared foods, transferring pathogenic bacteria. Cockroaches, omnipresent in human environments for millennia, carried bacteria on their bodies and left feces containing allergens and pathogens. There were no window screens, no paper towel dispensers, no effective pest control, just uncomfortable coexistence with these creatures. The concept of hand washing as an essential hygiene practice didn't exist in the form we know it. Water was too precious to waste on frequent washing. Soap, made from animal fat and wood ash, caustic lye, was harsh and unpleasant to use. Microbial theory wouldn't exist until the 19th century, so there was no concept of invisible germs being transferred from dirty hands to food. Cooks handled raw meat, then bread, then vegetables, then plated dishes, all with the same hands, without intermediate washing. When hands were washed, it was often in a shared basin of water that quickly became as contaminated as the hands it supposedly cleaned. There were also specific food preparation practices that introduced unique risks. Mortars, large stone bowls where ingredients were ground with pestles, were used extensively to grind spices, make pastes and sauces. These stone mortars had porous surfaces that absorbed residue from previous preparations, creating cross-contamination between batches. Garlic ground in a mortar on Monday could leave residue that contaminated almond paste made on Friday. Ground spices could carry traces of previous meat preparations, everything mixed in unpredictable and often unhygienic ways. The practice of tasting food, having servants or lower-ranking staff taste dishes before they were served to nobility, was primarily about detecting intentional poisoning, but inadvertently sometimes detected food deterioration. If the taster became visibly ill after tasting, the dish was rejected. But many foodborne illnesses have incubation periods of hours to days, so the taster would become ill long after the noble had already consumed the toxic dish. The system offered minimal real protection while placing servants at risk. Field kitchens during military campaigns or travels were even worse than established kitchens. Soldiers and travelers often ate poorly cooked food over hurried fires, drank from questionable water sources, and had zero access to adequate hygiene. Dysentery, called campaign flux, killed more soldiers than battles in many medieval wars. Medieval armies moving through territory frequently faced epidemic outbreaks of waterborne and foodborne diseases that decimated their ranks more effectively than any enemy. Compare the medieval kitchen with modern cooking shows where chefs work in impeccably clean kitchens with gleaming stainless steel equipment. But watch Kitchen Nightmares, where Gordon Ramsay exposes restaurant kitchens with rotting food, filthy surfaces, and rodent infestations, and you'll see that not all modern kitchens are so far removed from medieval conditions. Health inspections close restaurants regularly for violations that would have been completely normal in the Middle Ages: inadequate temperature storage, cross-contamination, insufficient cleaning. We've created regulations and standards, but enforcement is inconsistent, and some operators always cut corners when they think they can escape undetected. The preservation of leftovers and their reuse in subsequent meals was a common practice that multiplied risks. Roasted meat left over from Monday's dinner was cut and added to a pie on Tuesday, which was then reheated and served on Wednesday. Each heating and cooling cycle created opportunities for bacterial multiplication. The temperature danger zone between 40 degrees Celsius and 140 degrees Celsius, 44 degrees C to 60 degrees C, where bacteria multiply rapidly, was permanent in the medieval kitchen where food spent hours or days in these temperatures. Bacillus cereus, Staphylococcus aureus, Clostridium perfringens, all bacteria that cause foodborne poisoning through toxins produced in poorly stored foods, thrived in medieval storage conditions. Think of the final paradox. Every medieval meal was an act of faith, a bet that the invisible dangers lurking in every dish wouldn't kill you this time. People ate, waited, and if they didn't become drastically ill in the next few hours or days, considered the meal successful. Those with strong constitutions survived and reproduced. Those with weaker immune systems frequently died young. This brutal selection process over generations perhaps created populations with greater resistance to foodborne pathogens. But the cost was constant suffering and death, especially among children and the elderly. Today, when you order food for delivery, buy a prepared meal at the supermarket, or eat at a restaurant, you're making a similar act of faith, trusting that invisible systems of regulation, training, and inspection protect you from dangers you can't see, smell, or taste. Most of the time, this system works, but when it fails, E. coli outbreaks, listeria, salmonella, we're brutally reminded that the dangers haven't disappeared, just been pushed to the background through constant vigilance and technology. Relax that vigilance, cut regulations to save money, allow standards to slip, and we quickly regress toward medieval conditions. Food safety is not a natural state of things. It's a fragile construction that requires constant maintenance. And when we look at parts of the world where this infrastructure doesn't exist, we see that the medieval kitchen of slow death never really disappeared. It just changed addresses. We have reached the end of this journey through the smoky kitchens, opulent banquets, and humble tables of the Middle Ages, carrying with us vivid images of crystallized sugar in elaborate sculptures, meats dripping fat over glowing coals, beer replacing water from breakfast onward, exotic spices masking deterioration, bread hiding deadly fungi, and kitchens where every meal was a bet against invisible pathogens. But the question that should keep us awake, or perhaps paradoxically, lull us into deeper sleep is not simply how did they live, but rather what do their choices reveal about us? Because in every medieval excess, in every nutritional error, in every health risk accepted for convenience or status, we see distorted but recognizable reflections of our own eating behaviors. The table has changed, the utensils have modernized, scientific knowledge has advanced exponentially, but the fundamental human impulses, our desire for status, our pursuit of sensory pleasure, our willingness to deny future consequences for immediate satisfaction, remain remarkably constant. Throughout these 10 chapters, we've witnessed a disturbing pattern. In practically every case, what medieval society valued most intensely, refined sugar, abundant red meat, exotic spices, white bread, fried preparations in fat, were precisely the things most harmful to health. Meanwhile, the foods we now recognize as pillars of healthy nutrition, fresh vegetables, whole grains, legumes, fruits, were devalued, avoided by the elite, or consumed only out of economic necessity. This inversion was not accidental. It was the product of a value system where rarity equaled value, where mastery over nature through refinement and transformation was seen as superior to the natural, where demonstrating consumption beyond necessity was an essential way to communicate social power. Medievals weren't simply making nutritional errors out of ignorance, they were following a perfectly coherent cultural logic that prioritized status and social meaning over physical health. But here's the uncomfortable revelation: we haven't completely overcome this logic. We've changed its surface manifestations, substituted its theoretical justifications, but maintained many of its underlying impulses. When we consume ultra-processed foods loaded with sugar, salt and fats in quantities we know are harmful, not out of ignorance but out of convenience and emotional comfort, what exactly are we doing? When we eat meat in quantities that studies definitively link to cardiovascular risks and colorectal cancer, but rationalize with everything in moderation while rarely practicing that moderation, what is the fundamental difference from a medieval noble devouring his 4th kilogram of meat at a banquet? When we consume alcohol regularly to relax, despite knowing its cumulative effects on liver, brain, and longevity, how does this differ from medieval beer consumption from breakfast onward, except that they had the excuse of contaminated water, and we don't? The democratization of medieval excesses is perhaps the most significant and disturbing development of the past centuries. What was once a deadly privilege reserved for nobility, unlimited consumption of sugar, meat, fat, salt, is now available to the masses at prices that make these foods more accessible than healthy alternatives in many communities. Fast food offers unlimited meats for a few dollars. 2-liter sodas cost less than quality bottled water. Ultra-processed snacks are cheaper per calorie than fresh vegetables. We've essentially created a toxic democracy where everyone has equal right to poison themselves slowly in the same way only the rich could before. The diseases of abundance, obesity, type 2 diabetes, hypertension, cardiovascular disease, that once disproportionately afflicted the elite are now epidemic across all classes, with the cruel irony of often affecting most severely those with fewest resources to combat them through adequate medical care. The persistence of contradictory nutritional theories and fad diets in the full era of sophisticated nutritional science reveals something profound about human psychology. Medievals had the excuse of operating without microbiology, without biochemistry, without long-term epidemiological studies. They built elaborate systems, humoral theory, classifications of foods by hot and cold properties, that were internally logically consistent but factually wrong. And us? We live in an era where we have access to vast amounts of peer-reviewed nutritional research, yet we continue to be seduced by diets that promise magical solutions: eliminate carbohydrates, or eliminate fats, or eat only meat, or only raw vegetables, or fast intermittently, or meticulously count calories, or ignore calories completely. Each generation declares it has finally unlocked the secrets of optimal eating, only to be contradicted by the next wave of research or cultural trend. Is the genuine complexity of nutrition, interactions between individual genetics, microbiome, lifestyle, and hundreds of compounds in foods, simply more than our pattern-seeking brains can comfortably process? The question of food safety reveals genuine but incomplete progress. We no longer fear ergotism transforming our daily bread into a deadly hallucinogen. We no longer drink beer from childhood because water is lethal. We no longer coexist with rats infesting our pantries without alternative. Microbial theory, pasteurization, refrigeration, sanitization, government regulation, these are real and substantial victories that save millions of lives annually. But we've created new dangers that medievals never imagined. Persistent pesticides in every bite of produce, microplastics in our entire food chain, agricultural antibiotic use contributing to bacterial resistance, forever chemicals, PFAS, leaching from food packaging. We solved medieval problems of microbial contamination only to create chemical contamination operating on longer timescales and with potentially broader consequences. In 500 years, will researchers look at our 2025 eating practices with the same horror we view medieval kitchens? The role of social status and economic inequality in eating also shows disturbing continuity. Medievals had explicit food hierarchy: white bread for nobles, dark bread for peasants, game meat for elite, grains for masses, exotic spices for the rich, local garlic for the poor. Today we officially reject these hierarchies, but create new ones equally rigid: organic foods, farmers' market products, farm-to-table restaurants for those with resources, food deserts served by convenience stores, and fast food for low-income communities. Conscious eating has become a class marker as distinctive as rare spice consumption was medieval. And ironically, medieval peasants eating their whole grains, legumes and vegetables out of necessity often had superior nutrition to their lords, just as today the healthiest populations are often those in developing countries with traditional plant-based diets, whole grains and moderate proteins, precisely the places and practices that modern development and dietary westernization are rapidly eliminating. There's something profoundly human in how we use food to mean far more than sustenance. Food is love, comfort, celebration, cultural identity, memory, rebellion, conformity, art, religion, politics. Medievals understood this intuitively. Their banquets were theatrical performances of power. Their Lenten food restrictions were spiritual discipline. Their elaborate recipes were expressions of human creativity against nature. We maintain all these symbolic dimensions while simultaneously trying to reduce food to macronutrients, calories, and micronutrients. The result is cultural schizophrenia, where food must be simultaneously indulgent pleasure and optimized fuel, cultural expression and precise science, comforting tradition and disruptive innovation. It's no surprise that many of us have deeply conflicted relationships with food, oscillating between restriction and excess, between guilt and pleasure, never finding comfortable balance. The medicalization of eating, the concept of food as medicine, curiously connects our era with the medieval. Medieval physicians prescribed specific foods for specific conditions based on humoral theory. We prescribe diets for diabetes, hypertension, high cholesterol, based on modern biochemistry. Both eras recognize that what we eat profoundly affects our health. The difference is that we have actual causal mechanisms where they had speculative theory. But does our superior knowledge make us better at actually following dietary prescriptions? Studies show that most people can't maintain dietary changes long-term, even when they know they're necessary for health. Compliance with nutritional recommendations is notoriously low. Perhaps knowledge alone is never sufficient against powerful forces of habit, culture, economics, evolutionary biology, and a food industry that profits from keeping us addicted to sugar, salt, and fat. The modern food industry is in many ways the heir to medieval cooks and merchants who masked inferior quality with heavy seasoning, who stretched expensive products with cheap adulterants, who prioritized profit over consumer health. But the scale has changed dramatically. A dishonest medieval baker could poison his village with contaminated grain. A modern food corporation can affect the health of millions through carefully engineered formulations that exploit human neurobiology. The bliss point of sugar, salt, and fat that maximizes addiction and consumption. The difference is that now this is legal, sophisticated, defended by armies of lawyers and corporate scientists, and packaged in marketing that associates harmful products with health, family, happiness, and personal identity. Medievals never dreamed of such systematic and scientific manipulation of human eating behavior. But here's the message of hope we cannot ignore. You are not alone in this journey of understanding our complex and often contradictory relationship with food. Each episode of Sleeping Times creates space for reflection, for questioning assumptions, for seeing patterns across time that connect all of us. We are a community of curious minds that refuse to accept simplicities, that embrace complexity, that find comfort not in easy answers, but in well-formulated questions. If these stories have resonated with you, if you found yourself thinking differently about choices you make every day, you belong here. Subscribe now, not just to receive notifications of new episodes, but to join a community of nocturnal thinkers who know that the best reflections happen when the world quiets, and we have the courage to look honestly at the mirrors the past offers us. Together we're writing a new story, one where we learn from our ancestors not to judge them, but to understand ourselves better. You are an essential part of this shared journey. There remains a question unanswered after our exploration. Given that we know so much more than medievals, why do we continue making structurally similar errors? One possible answer is that intellectual knowledge is necessary but not sufficient for behavioral change. Knowing something is harmful doesn't automatically make us stop doing it when that something provides immediate pleasure, emotional comfort, social connection, or meets deep biological impulses. Smokers know cigarettes kill. Alcoholics know alcohol destroys livers. Obese people know excess weight shortens lives. The knowledge is there, but change requires infrastructure of support, sustained motivation, economic resources, social support, and often systemic changes beyond individual control. Blaming individuals for bad choices while ignoring the toxic food environments we've created is like blaming medievals for drinking contaminated water when it was the only option available. Another perspective is evolutionary. Our brains and bodies were shaped by millions of years of scarcity. Preferences for sweet, fatty, and salty were adaptive advantages when calories were scarce and physical work was constant. Medievals at least burned their excess calories through intense manual labor. We've maintained the evolved preferences but created an environment of caloric abundance and sedentariness, an evolutionary mismatch our genes can't adjust to in mere generations. We're essentially Stone Age creatures operating in a modern world with all the resulting problems. Real solutions may require not just nutritional education, but fundamental redesign of built environments, food policies, cultural norms, changes on a scale that will take generations and encounter massive resistance from established interests. The final reflection, the one that gently lulls us towards sleep or peaceful thought, is about accepting human imperfection across time. Medievals weren't stupid and we aren't enlightened. Both are humans doing the best we can with available tools, inherent cognitive limitations, social and economic pressures, and internal contradictions between knowledge and desire. They built magnificent cathedrals while eating poisoned bread. We send probes to Mars while struggling to eat enough vegetables. Each era has its own forms of genius and madness intertwined. Perhaps the lesson isn't that we should shame ourselves for present failures by comparing to some imagined perfect future, but rather cultivate compassion for our shared humanity, recognizing that we do our imperfect best in imperfect systems, and that real change comes not from judgment but from curiosity, experimentation, failure, learning, and trying again. The medieval table is set forever in history, with all its toxic delights and nutritional scarcity. Our table is set now with our own paradoxes. What choices will we make knowing that future generations will look back and wonder about us with the same mixture of fascination, horror, and recognition that we feel looking at them? The history of food is the history of humanity. All our ambitions and failures, all our ingenuity and stubbornness, all our love and destructiveness served on every plate. Sleep well, knowing that tomorrow you will make choices, as your ancestors did, with hope that perhaps, just perhaps, we can learn enough from our past errors to make the future a little less toxic and a little more sustainable. And if we can't, at least we will have tried with open eyes and curious hearts. Good night.